It was a Saturday evening in April, the kind where the light stays soft over Nashville until almost 8 o'clock, and I was standing at my kitchen counter finishing the dishes when I heard a knock at the front door. Adam was out in the garage, sanding down a mantelpiece for a client in Green Hills. I could hear the low hum of his sander through the wall. Steady and familiar. Casey was back at school in Knoxville, 3 weeks from finals, probably still awake and buried in a textbook about wound care. I wiped my hands on a dish towel, and I walked toward the door expecting a neighbor, or maybe a package I'd forgotten I ordered. I was not expecting my parents. Walter stood on the top step, holding his hat in both hands, the way men of his generation do when they aren't sure they're welcome somewhere. His hair had gone almost fully white. His shoulders, once so squared and certain, had curved inward, the posture of a man who had spent years apologizing to someone, even if that someone was never me. Judith stood just behind his shoulder, her coat buttoned to the collar even though the evening air was warm enough that I'd left my own windows cracked open all afternoon. And a few feet back, almost swallowed by the shadow at the edge of the porch light, stood my younger brother, Grant, 15 years. That's how long it had been since I'd stood this close to any of them. Nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. I remember the porch light humming faintly overhead, the way it always did in humid weather. I remember a car passing slowly on the street behind them, its headlights sweeping briefly across my father's face, and how old he looked in that passing light, how much smaller than the man who used to fill every doorway he walked through, 15 years earlier, in a living room 400 miles from where I now stood. My mother had looked directly at me and said something I had never once forgotten, not for a single day since. I could hear it now, clear as if she were saying it again, right there on my porch, in that same flat, certain voice. Disowning you is the best decision this family will ever make. She had believed it completely. I had watched her believe it, watched the conviction settle into her face like something final, and for a long stretch of years afterward, some small, stubborn part of me had wondered, quietly, whether she might have been right. Renee. My father's voice cracked slightly on the single syllable of my name, as though he hadn't used it in a long while and had nearly forgotten the shape of it in his mouth. I didn't answer right away. I stood there in my own doorway, in the house I had built with a man they had never met, raised a daughter they had never once asked to see, and I felt 15 years of silence pressing down on my chest all at once, heavier than I expected it to be after so much time. Then my mother spoke, and her voice was smaller than I remembered it being. Smaller than the voice that had once told me I was no longer her daughter in front of the only home I'd ever known. "We have nowhere else to go," she said. I want to tell you I felt triumphant in that moment, that some old, wounded part of me finally got to watch them stand small on my porch the way I had once stood small in their living room. I didn't feel that. What I felt was closer to vertigo, like the ground beneath the porch boards had quietly tilted a few degrees while nobody was looking, and none of us had quite caught our balance yet. Behind them, Grant still hadn't said a word. He hadn't 15 years ago either. I noticed that before I noticed almost anything else, the way you notice the one detail in a familiar photograph that never changes no matter how many years pass. In my line of work, I spend most of my days walking into houses where families are unraveling in exactly this kind of quiet, public way. I have learned to read the posture of people standing on a threshold before they say a single word. I read Walter's hands first, the way they gripped the brim of his hat too tightly. I read Judith's coat, buttoned wrong on the second hole from the top, a small unraveling that told me more than her face did. Whatever brought them here hadn't been planned calmly over a cup of coffee. It had been decided somewhere on the drive, or maybe not decided at all. I thought about closing the door. I want to be honest about that, because forgiveness was not the first thing I felt standing there. What I felt first was the old familiar instinct to protect myself, sharpened by 15 years of practice. To understand why 3 people I had once called family were standing on my porch like strangers waiting to be let in out of the cold. You have to go back further than that evening. You have to go back to the spring I turned 34, back to Bardstown, Kentucky, back to a modest brick house that smelled like lavender soap, and a small piece of paper with a signature that didn't look quite right, because everything that happened afterward, the 15 years of silence, the knock on my door on an ordinary Saturday evening, the words my mother once used like a verdict passed down from a judge who never doubted herself, all of it started with something as small as a single line of ink, shaking where it should have been steady. Bardstown, Kentucky, is the kind of town where everybody's grandfather knew everybody else's grandfather, where the church you attended told people more about you than your last name did, and where a business that had survived 3 generations was treated less like a company and more like a member of the family tree. Callaway Feed and Hardware had been standing on the same corner of Main Street since my great-grandfather built it out of salvaged lumber and stubbornness. By the time I was 34, my father, Walter, had run it for almost 40 years. And he wore that fact the way some men wear a uniform. He knew every farmer within 30 miles by name. He extended credit to families during lean seasons and never once mentioned it again once the debt was paid. In Bardstown, the name Callaway meant something. It meant reliability. It meant a family that showed up. I believed that too. Back then. I believed it the way you believe the ground under your feet is solid, without ever once thinking to check. My mother, Judith, had taught 2nd grade for almost 2 decades before she stepped back to run the women's committee at First Baptist, organizing everything from the Christmas pageant to the casserole rotation whenever somebody in the congregation lost a spouse. She cared, deeply and genuinely, about how our family looked from the outside, not out of vanity exactly, but because in a town the size of Bardstown, how a family looked from the outside was very often mistaken for what a family actually was. My younger brother, Grant, was 26 that spring, already working under my father at the store, already being spoken of around town as the one who would take it over someday. Nobody ever said it about me. I don't think anyone, including me, thought it strange at the time. That was simply how things were arranged. I was living in a small rented house 2 streets over from my parents that spring, finishing my degree in social work at the community college in Elizabethtown, driving the 40 minutes back and forth 3 days a week. I hadn't married yet. I hadn't met Adam yet, hadn't even imagined a version of my life that included him. Most of my free time, the time I wasn't studying or working part-time at a pediatrician's office to cover rent, I spent with my grandmother, Opal. Opal Callaway had been an army nurse before she married my grandfather, and she carried herself like it for the rest of her life, spine straight, opinions clear, patience worn thin for nonsense but endless for anyone who was actually hurting. She lived alone in the house my grandfather had left her, 3 blocks from the store, in a kitchen that always smelled faintly of lavender soap and coffee left on the burner too long. I went by most Sunday afternoons. Sometimes I brought groceries. Mostly I just sat at her table and listened. Her kitchen was small, the linoleum floor curling slightly at one corner near the back door, a wall calendar from the feed store hanging crooked above the phone. None of it mattered to her. And after a while, none of it mattered to me either. What mattered was the way she listened to me talk about my coursework, about the families I was starting to work with during my field placement, and told me more than once that she thought I'd chosen exactly the right kind of work. Somebody's gotta notice when the quiet ones are struggling, she told me once. Most people are too busy to look. She told the same stories more than once. But I never minded. She told me about the field hospital in Germany where she'd worked as a young woman, about my grandfather losing part of his hearing in a training accident before they'd even married, about the years after the war when money was tight and nobody complained about it because everybody's money was tight. And she told me, more than once, about a promise she'd made to herself a long time ago. "There's a place outside town," she said to me one Sunday in March, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer. "Fielding House. For men who came back from wherever they'd been and couldn't quite come all the way home. Your grandfather spent a night there once, years before I met him, when he had nowhere else to go. I've told the woman who runs it that when I'm gone, there'll be something for them. It's already decided. I just haven't gotten around to the paperwork. I remember smiling at her, telling her there was no rush, that she had plenty of years left to get around to paperwork. I remember the light coming through her kitchen window at a low, golden angle, the kind of light that makes you believe an afternoon like that one will simply keep repeating itself, unchanged, for as long as you need it to. I remember, too, the small habits that had started creeping into her days without either of us naming them out loud, the way she sometimes asked me the same question twice within an hour, the way she'd once called me by my mother's name and laughed it off as tiredness. I noticed. I told myself it was nothing. 81 was not so old, I reasoned. Not for a woman who still did her own crossword every morning in ink, refusing to allow herself the safety net of a pencil. I had no idea, sitting there, how soon all of that would change. I had no idea that the promise she'd just described to me so calmly, over coffee gone lukewarm, was about to become the single most contested piece of paper in our family's history, or that I would be the one who found out somebody had already gotten around to it, in a way she never intended. The first thing that felt wrong happened on a Tuesday, in the back office of the store, and I almost missed it entirely. I'd stopped by to drop off a casserole dish my mother had borrowed and never returned. One of those small errands that fill the space between a person's real life and their family obligations. The front of the store was busy that afternoon, a line of farmers waiting on fence posts and 50-pound bags of feed, the smell of sawdust and diesel and cracked corn hanging in the air the way it always did on a Tuesday in planting season. Grant was working the register, calling out prices from memory the way our father had taught him, already comfortable in that role in a way I never once was. I gave him a small wave. He nodded back without quite meeting my eyes, already reaching for the next customer's order. I walked around back toward the office to leave the dish on my father's desk, and I heard voices through the half-open door before I saw who they belonged to. One was my father's. The other belonged to Harlan Pruitt. I knew Harlan the way everybody in Bardstown knew him, which is to say I knew his face, his firm's name stenciled in gold on the glass door 2 blocks down from the courthouse, and the fact that he'd handled the Calloway family's legal matters for as long as I could remember. He'd drawn up the paperwork when my parents refinanced the store in the 80s. He'd handled my grandfather's estate when he passed. He was less a hired lawyer to us than a kind of extended relative, the sort of man who came to Christmas parties because he'd always come to Christmas parties. Through the gap in the door, I heard him say something about the new power of attorney, and my father's voice, lower than usual, telling him, "Let's keep this simple. Harlan, she doesn't need to be worried with the details." I stepped into the doorway before I'd fully decided to. Who doesn't need to be worried with what details both men looked up? Harlan recovered first, the way lawyers generally do, folding a manila folder closed with a small, practiced motion that I would come to recognize, years later, as the exact gesture of a man closing a door on a conversation before it could go anywhere he didn't want it to go. He smiled at me the way he'd smiled at me at every Christmas party since I was a child, warm and unhurried, a smile that had never once given me a reason to distrust it. "Just some paperwork for your grandmother," Renee, nothing to concern yourself with. You know how these things go, every family gets around to it eventually. What kind of paperwork? I asked again, and I heard my own voice come out a little sharper than I'd intended. My father's jaw tightened in a way I recognized from childhood. The look he wore whenever a conversation was about to end, whether or not everyone in the room was finished having it. "It's business," he said. "Not yours to worry about." "Grandma's business is my business," I said, and I meant it lightly, almost as a joke, the kind of thing a granddaughter says without thinking too hard about it. Neither of them laughed. "She's getting older, Renee," my father said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, something rehearsed. "Things need to be in order. That's all this is. Being responsible." I remember nodding, because it did sound reasonable when he said it that way, and because I had no particular reason yet to doubt him. He was my father. He had spent 40 years being the most trustworthy man on that stretch of Main Street, the kind of man other men in town still shook hands with on a debt instead of asking for it in writing. It did not occur to me, standing in that doorway with a borrowed casserole dish still in my hands, that a man could spend 40 years earning trust and then spend one afternoon quietly deciding to spend it. I left the dish on the desk and drove home telling myself it was nothing, that I'd simply walked into the middle of an ordinary conversation about ordinary paperwork, the kind every family eventually has to deal with. Grandparents aged, estates got organized, lawyers got called. None of that was, on its own, a reason to feel the way I felt driving down Main Street with the windows cracked. Some low current of unease humming underneath everything else I was thinking about that day. It was only later, lying awake that night for reasons I couldn't fully name, that I found myself replaying the exact words Harlan had used. Not paperwork for your grandmother's care, not paperwork to help your grandmother, just simply unsettlingly. Paperwork for your grandmother, the way you might talk about paperwork for a piece of property rather than a person. I thought about calling Opal right then, just to hear her voice, just to ask if anyone had been by to see her that week. I didn't. It was nearly 11 o'clock, and I told myself she'd already be asleep, and that whatever this was could wait until Sunday. I told myself I was reading too much into a single phrase, worn thin by a long day and an overactive imagination. I was wrong about that, though it would be several more weeks before I understood exactly how wrong, and by then, some of what had already been decided could not be easily undone. 3 weeks later, I drove over to help Opal sort through a stack of mail that had been piling up on her kitchen table, a task that had become part of our Sunday routine without either of us ever officially deciding it should be. Bills in one pile, church bulletins in another, anything that looked remotely official. I set aside to read to her out loud, because her eyes had started giving her trouble with small print and she was too proud most days to admit it outright. That was how I found it. A cream-colored envelope from Pruitt and Kessler, already opened, already read, tucked between a seed catalog and a card from a cousin in Louisville. Inside was a single typed page, a durable power of attorney, dated barely 2 weeks earlier, granting financial authority over Opal's accounts and property to my father, Walter Calloway, effective immediately. That alone wouldn't have alarmed me. Power of attorney documents exist for exactly this reason: to protect people as they age, and naming my father, her only son, would have made a certain kind of sense. What stopped me cold was the second page, a short addendum listing specific accounts and their designated purposes, and one line near the bottom, in the same flat legal language as everything else on the page, redirecting what it called the Fielding House Pledge Account into what it described as Operating Capital, Callaway Feed and Hardware. I read it twice, then a third time, slower, in case I'd misunderstood something. I hadn't. "Grandma," I said, keeping my voice as even as I could manage. Do you remember signing this? Opal took the page from my hands and studied it for a long moment, her reading glasses slipping down her nose. Something moved across her face that I hadn't seen there before, a kind of fog settling in behind her eyes. Walter brought some papers by, she said slowly. Said it was for the store. Something about the roof needing work before winter. She looked up at me, and for just a second, there was real uncertainty in her expression, an uncertainty that frightened me more than anything on the page itself. I trust him. Don't I trust him? He's my son. Do you remember what you signed? Specifically, she was quiet for a long moment. There were a lot of papers, she finally said. Harlan explained it. I think I understood it at the time. I looked down at the signature on the page, and it was hers, unmistakably hers. But the letters wavered in a way I had never once seen in her handwriting before, not even on days when her hands ached from the cold. I thought about her crossword puzzles, always done in confident, steady ink. I thought about the promise she had described to me in March, calm and certain, about Fielding House and the men who came back from wherever they'd been and couldn't quite make it all the way home. I did not say anything else about it that afternoon. I made her tea. I asked about the crossword instead, and she brightened immediately. Glad, I think, to be back on solid ground. But I drove home that night with the photocopy I'd quietly made at the library on my way, sitting on the passenger seat like something radioactive. And I understood, with a clarity that made my hands go cold on the steering wheel, that I had two choices in front of me, and neither one of them was going to let me go back to believing what I'd believed about my family only a few weeks before. I spent the better part of that week arguing with myself, alone, in a way that left me exhausted by Thursday. Part of me wanted to believe my father completely, wanted it so badly that I actually rehearsed the innocent explanation in my head until it almost sounded plausible. Maybe the roof really did need repairing. Maybe Opal had genuinely wanted to help with the store and simply forgotten the conversation, the way she'd started forgetting other small things that spring. Families lent each other money constantly in Bardstown. Nobody thought twice about it. But another part of me, the part that had spent 2 years in a graduate program learning exactly what financial exploitation of an elderly person looked like in its earliest and most deniable form, could not stop hearing Harlan's words in that office. Paperwork for your grandmother. Not paperwork with her. Not paperwork to protect her. I thought about the wavering signature. I thought about the fog that had passed behind her eyes when I asked her a simple question about what she'd signed. I thought about a professor who had once told our class, almost as an aside, that the people who did this kind of harm rarely looked like villains. Usually, she'd said, they looked exactly like somebody's beloved father. I called my mother twice that week, hoping, I think, that she would say something reassuring enough to let me set the whole thing down. Both times. She changed the subject before I could finish asking, steering the conversation toward the church rummage sale or a recipe she wanted to try. The second time, there was a brief, strange pause on the line before she did it, barely a second long. Easy to miss if you weren't listening for it. I was listening for it. It was a pause I would think about for years afterward, long after I'd learned exactly what it meant, and exactly how much she had already known when she chose to fill it with talk of casseroles instead. I want to tell you I made the decision quickly, decisively. The way people in movies make decisions like this, I didn't. I carried that photocopy folded inside my textbook for 11 days, taking it out at night to reread it, folding it back up before I could talk myself into either burning it or bringing it straight to my father and asking him to explain himself man to woman, parent to child, the way a normal family might have handled something like this. I didn't bring it to him. Some instinct, sharpened later by years of professional training, but already present in me that spring in a rawer, less articulate form, told me that confronting him directly would only give him time to smooth the paper over before anyone outside the family ever saw it. I had learned enough already, in my coursework, to understand that documents could be redone, refiled, quietly corrected once a family member started asking questions, especially with a lawyer as practiced and well-liked as Harlan Pruitt standing ready to help make the correction look routine. Evidence, once flagged by an outside authority, moved faster than explanations offered from inside a family's own living room. I needed to flag it first, before anyone had the chance to talk me out of what I'd seen with my own eyes. On a Tuesday morning, sitting alone in my rented kitchen with the coffee going cold beside me, I called the number listed on a laminated card I'd been given during a training session earlier that year. The toll-free hotline for Adult Protective Services in Kentucky. I remember my hand shaking slightly as I dialed, and I remember being surprised by how calm the woman's voice was on the other end, how ordinary the whole exchange felt. Like reporting a pothole or a broken streetlight rather than something that was about to detonate my entire family. I told her only what I actually knew. I did not accuse anyone of anything. I described the power of attorney, the date, the addendum about the pledge account, the wavering signature, the confusion I'd seen in my grandmother's face when I asked her about it. I gave the woman my name, Opal's address, and my relationship to her. She told me someone would follow up, that the call could remain confidential on my end if I wished it to, and that Kentucky law required any concerned citizen, not only professionals, to report exactly this kind of suspicion. After I hung up, I sat at my kitchen table for a long time without moving, the phone still warm in my hand, the coffee gone fully cold now, a thin skin forming on top of it that I noticed and didn't bother to fix. I felt something close to relief. The physical loosening of a tension I hadn't fully realized I'd been carrying in my shoulders for almost 2 weeks. But underneath the relief was something colder, something closer to dread. Because I understood, even then, that I had just set something in motion that could not be quietly undone. Whatever happened next, I would not be able to control it, and I would not be able to take it back. I called an attorney too, a woman named Diane Foss, 2 counties over, someone with no ties to my family or a Harlan Pruitt's firm, and asked her, in general terms, what a family member's options were if they suspected an elderly relative's paperwork had been altered under questionable circumstances. She was kind and direct in the way I would later come to recognize as a hallmark of good elder law attorneys, the kind who had clearly delivered this same careful explanation to frightened, uncertain family members many times before. She told me investigators would look primarily at 3 things: whether Opal had the mental capacity to understand what she was signing at the exact moment she signed it, whether the timing of the changes lined up suspiciously with any decline in that capacity, and whether the changes disproportionately benefited the person who had arranged for them to be made. All 3, she said carefully, without ever quite saying it outright, sounded like they might apply here. She told me, gently, to prepare myself for the possibility that not everyone in my family would understand why I had made the call I'd made. Families protect their own version of events, she said, sometimes even more fiercely than they protect the people those events actually happen to. I remember sitting with the phone against my ear, looking out at my small backyard, at a bird feeder Opal had given me for my birthday 2 years earlier, and feeling for the first time the full weight of what I might be about to lose. I told Diane I understood. I did not. Not really. Not yet. Understanding, I would learn, was not something that arrived all at once. It came in pieces, over months and then years, delivered by people who had once loved me and had decided, somewhere along the way, that loving me was no longer worth the cost of believing me. It would be another 11 days before a state investigator's car, unmarked, plain and gray, pulled up outside my parents' house on a quiet Thursday afternoon. It would be another 2 weeks after that before I found out exactly how little my family was prepared to forgive me for telling the truth, and how completely they had already decided, before I ever said a single word to defend myself, which version of this story they intended to believe. The investigator's name was Ms. Renfro. She wore a gray blazer and carried a leather folder, and she spent 40 minutes alone with Opal in her kitchen while I waited outside on the porch steps, my stomach in knots, watching a neighbor's dog wander back and forth across the yard next door like nothing in the world was wrong. When Ms. Renfro finally came out, she thanked me for the report, told me the investigation would continue, and said nothing else. That was Thursday. By Sunday, everyone in Bardstown seemed to know. I went to the grocery store that Saturday morning and felt it before I understood it. A change in the way people looked at me across the produce aisle. A cashier who usually chatted with me about the weather now ringing up my items in near silence. Mrs. Denny, who had taught Sunday school to half the town at one point or another, stopped me by the bread display and asked, in a voice pitched carefully between concern and judgment, whether it was true that I'd called the state on my own grandmother. I told her it wasn't like that. She nodded in the way people nod when they've already decided not to believe you, and moved on down the aisle without another word. I don't know exactly how word traveled so fast in a town that size, whether it came from someone at the courthouse, or someone who worked for Harlan, or simply the ordinary, merciless efficiency of small-town gossip. But by the time I pulled into my parents' driveway that evening, summoned there by a single terse phone call from my father, I understood from the look on his face in the doorway that whatever version of this story had already spread through town, I was not the hero of it. He didn't invite me in so much as step aside just enough to let me pass, his jaw so tight I could see the muscle working under his cheek. My mother was standing near the fireplace, arms crossed, her face composed in a way that frightened me more than anger would have. Grant stood off to one side, near the hallway, saying nothing, looking at the floor. "Do you have any idea?" my father said, before I'd even fully crossed the threshold. "What you've done to this family's name." I told them what I saw. Dad, a signature that didn't look right, Grandma not remembering what she signed. "You went behind my back to the state of Kentucky," he said, his voice rising with every word, "over paperwork you don't understand, for a business you've never once shown a single day of interest in running. Do you understand what people are saying about us right now, about me? I understand that Grandma's pledge to Fielding House got quietly rerouted into the store's accounts 3 weeks after her handwriting started shaking on the page," I said. My own voice was steadier than I expected it to be, though my hands were not. "I understand that Harlan called it paperwork for her instead of paperwork with her. I understand that when I asked her what she'd signed, she couldn't tell me." "She's an old woman," my mother said sharply, stepping forward for the first time. "Old women forget things. That is not a crime. Renee, what you did is—" "I didn't accuse anyone of a crime. I made one phone call because I was worried about her." "You embarrassed this family in front of the whole town," my mother said, and something in her voice had gone flat and final, the sound of a decision already made long before I'd walked through the door. 40 years your father has spent building a good name in this community. 40 years, undone in one afternoon, because you couldn't mind your own business. She's my grandmother. She is my business." My father crossed the room in 3 short steps, close enough that I could see how red his face had gone. "You are not welcome in this house," he said. "Not until you understand what you've done." I looked at my mother, waiting, foolishly, for her to soften, to be the one who pulled the room back from the edge the way she so often had when I was a child. She didn't. She looked at me with an expression I had never once seen on her face before. Something between grief and certainty, as though she had already grieved the daughter standing in front of her and moved past it into something colder. "Disowning you," she said quietly, "is the best decision this family will ever make." Nobody spoke after that. I looked toward Grant. Some old habit of hoping a younger sibling might say something, anything, in your defense. He kept his eyes on the floor and said nothing at all, and I would spend years afterward wondering exactly what he had said to them, quietly, in the days before I arrived. I walked out of that house alone, into a driveway lit orange by the last of the evening sun. And I remember standing beside my car for a long moment before I trusted myself to drive. I did not cry. Not then. The crying came later, weeks later, in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday for no reason I could point to. That night I only felt strangely, terribly clear-headed, the way I imagine people feel after surgery, once the worst of it is already over and there's nothing left to do but assess what has been removed. I did not go back inside that house again for 15 years. I would drive past it sometimes, on visits to see Opal before things changed further. And I would slow down without meaning to, the way you slow down, passing the site of an accident. Some part of you still trying to make sense of how something so ordinary could have ended so completely. I left Bardstown 3 weeks later, in a used Honda Civic I'd bought with money I'd been saving toward a wedding that, at the time, existed only as a vague and distant idea. I didn't tell many people where I was going, partly because I wasn't entirely sure myself, and partly because I had learned, in a very short amount of time, exactly how quickly information traveled through that town and back to people who no longer wished me well. Nashville was close enough to reach in a single afternoon of driving, and far enough that I wouldn't run into someone from Bardstown at the grocery store. I found a one-bedroom apartment above a shoe repair shop on the east side of the city, the kind of place with a radiator that clanked all winter and a landlord who never quite fixed the bathroom faucet. And I told myself it was temporary. The way you tell yourself a lot of things in the first hard months after your whole life reorganizes itself without your permission. I had to withdraw from my program at the community college in Elizabethtown, since I could no longer make the drive. And I lost most of a semester's credit transferring my coursework to a university in Nashville that would accept it. I worked 2 jobs that first year, waiting tables most nights at a diner near Vanderbilt, and doing filing work 3 mornings a week at a small law office, just to cover rent and the difference in tuition. Some weeks I worked 6 days straight without a single one off, and I remember being tired in a way that went past ordinary exhaustion, a tiredness that had roots in something other than the hours I was keeping, something closer to grief that hadn't found the time yet to fully announce itself. My younger sister on my mother's side, my Aunt Deb's daughter, sent me a card that first Christmas with no return address. Just a short note inside saying she didn't agree with what the family had done and hoped I was doing all right. I kept that card in a drawer for years. It was, for a long stretch of time, the only proof I had that anyone back home still thought of me as someone worth checking on. There were nights I lay awake wondering if I had done the wrong thing entirely, if some quieter, more patient version of myself could have found another way to protect Opal without blowing apart everything else in the process. I would run the whole sequence of events over in my mind, searching for the moment I could have chosen differently, and I never found one. Not really. Not one that didn't also mean staying silent while somebody I loved was being quietly taken advantage of. That certainty didn't make the loneliness any smaller. It only made it more bearable to carry. My first Thanksgiving in Nashville. I worked a double shift at the diner because I couldn't stand the idea of sitting alone in that apartment listening to the radiator clank, while I imagined what was happening 400 miles away, around a table I could picture in perfect detail without ever closing my eyes. A regular customer, an older woman who came in most Sundays for the same order of eggs and dry wheat toast, noticed I was working the holiday alone and asked gently if everything was all right at home. I told her there wasn't really a home to go back to that year. She didn't press further. She just left an extra $20 under her plate and told me, on her way out, that some of the kindest people she'd ever known had spent at least one Thanksgiving completely alone. I have thought about that woman more times than I can count in the years since. Slowly, though, something else began to take shape underneath the exhaustion. In my new coursework, I found myself drawn again and again toward classes focused on aging, on cognition, on the specific and often invisible ways older adults could be exploited by the very people meant to protect them. My professors, I think, could tell there was something personal driving the intensity I brought to those units, though I never once explained why. I didn't need to explain it. The work explained itself to me, a little more clearly, every single semester. By the time I finished my degree, 2 years after driving out of Bardstown with everything I owned packed into the back of that Civic, I had chosen a specialization nobody in my family had ever heard of and would not have understood if I'd tried to describe it to them. I was going to spend my career doing exactly the kind of work that had cost me my family in the first place. Sitting across kitchen tables from other people's aging parents, reading other people's power of attorney documents line by line, asking the kinds of careful questions nobody had asked on my behalf until I asked them myself. Some people might call that a strange kind of stubbornness. I have always thought of it as the only version of my old life I was allowed to keep. The one part of that spring in Bardstown that nobody could take back from me no matter how completely they'd taken everything else. I still remember the exact moment I decided. Sitting in a lecture hall listening to a guest speaker describe a case eerily similar to my grandmother's, feeling something settle into place in my chest that felt less like ambition and more like inheritance. Whatever else had been stolen from me that spring, this much I still owned outright I knew. Better than almost anyone in that room. Exactly what it looked like when it was happening. And exactly how much it mattered to have somebody willing to notice. 2 years after I left Bardstown, I got a call from a woman named Patrice, an aide at the assisted living facility where Opal had moved after a fall in her kitchen made living alone no longer safe. Patrice had gotten my number, she explained carefully, from an old address book in Opal's nightstand, and she was calling on her own initiative, not the family's. Because Opal had been asking for me by name for 3 days straight and nobody else seemed inclined to make the drive. I went the following Saturday, telling no one in my family I was coming. Timing my visit for a Tuesday afternoon 2 weeks later when I learned, through Patrice, that my parents typically visited on weekends, usually Sunday after church, usually for less than an hour before they had somewhere else to be. It felt like something close to trespassing. Sneaking into a building to see my own grandmother, and the unfairness of that feeling sat heavy in my chest the entire drive. Opal was having what Patrice called one of her clearer days. She was sitting by the window in a small, sunlit room that smelled faintly of the same lavender soap from her old kitchen, and when I walked in, her face broke open into something so immediately uncomplicatedly happy that I had to look away for a moment before I could compose myself. "There you are," she said, reaching for my hand the moment I sat down beside her. "I was starting to think I'd made you up. We talked for a long while about small things, safe things, the crossword she could no longer quite manage on her own. A nurse she liked and one she didn't. A cardinal that visited the feeder outside her window most mornings. A rerun of a game show she watched every afternoon at 4 and complained about while never once missing an episode. Then, without any particular change in her tone, as though she were still discussing the weather. She said something that stopped my heart. "I know what happened. Renee. I know why you called who you called. I've known for a while now, longer than anyone thinks I know things these days." Her grip on my hand tightened slightly. "You were the only one brave enough to say something out loud. I want you to know I've never once blamed you for it. Not for one single day. I couldn't speak. I sat there holding her hand, tears running freely down my face, unable to form a single word in response. I did something," she continued, her voice lower now, more deliberate, as though she were choosing each word with unusual care. "Before things got too muddled in my own head to trust myself with it, I've made sure you'll always have something in this world that's truly yours, something nobody in this family can ever touch, or take, or talk you out of. A friend from church helped me arrange it properly. Not Harlan. Never Harlan. Not for this." "What do you mean? Grandma, what did you do?" She patted my hand, and something in her expression shifted, a fog rolling back in behind her eyes the way I had seen it do before, the clarity of a moment closing over like water. "You'll know when it's time," she said, and though I pressed her gently for more, she couldn't, or wouldn't, say anything further that afternoon, drifting instead into a story about the cardinal I had already heard twice that day. I visited her twice more over the following months, whenever I could manage the drive and the secrecy both. The last time she didn't fully recognize me, though she held my hand just as tightly as she always had, some part of her still responding to a familiarity her memory could no longer name outright. She passed away that November, quietly, in her sleep. Nobody in my family called to tell me. I found out 3 days later, from Patrice, after the funeral had already happened without me. I found out later, again through Patrice, that my father had stood up at the service and given a eulogy about a devoted mother who had always put family first above everything else. I wasn't there to hear it, but Patrice described it to me carefully over the phone, her voice apologetic, as though she were somehow responsible for the unfairness of it. I thought about the addendum to that power of attorney, the wavering signature, the fog behind Opal's eyes when I'd asked her a simple question in her own kitchen. And I thought about how easily a eulogy could rewrite a person's whole final chapter for a room full of people who would never think to ask harder questions. I did not attend the burial either. I drove out to the cemetery alone, weeks later, on a gray Tuesday afternoon, and stood at her grave by myself for a long while, saying the things I hadn't been given the chance to say out loud in front of anyone who had actually loved her the way I had. I told her I understood, finally. Some part of what she'd been trying to tell me in that sunlit room. I told her I would wait, however long it took, to know what she'd meant. I have never fully forgiven my family for that funeral, for the phone call that never came, for 3 days of not knowing while they buried her without me. I'm not certain I ever will, and for a long time, I stopped expecting myself to. I met Adam almost exactly a year after Opal died, though it would take me a long time afterward to notice that the two events sat so close together in my memory, as though one had somehow made room for the other. A late summer storm tore a section of shingles off the duplex I was renting by then, and my landlord, apologetic and slow to act on most things, finally sent someone out to fix it after I'd called him for the 3rd time in 2 weeks. Adam showed up on a Wednesday morning in a truck with his last name stenciled on the door, Reyes Restoration, and spent most of that day on my roof without complaining once about the heat. He knocked on my door around noon to ask if he could use my hose to rinse off some debris, and somehow that turned into him fixing a dripping showerhead in the hall bathroom free of charge, simply because he'd noticed it while he was up there and happened to have the part in his truck. I remember being suspicious of that kind of generosity at first. I had spent enough of my life by then learning to distrust people who offered things without being asked. "You don't have to do that," I told him, standing in the doorway of the bathroom, arms crossed. "I know," he said, not looking up from what he was doing. Figured I'd do it anyway. He didn't flirt with me, not exactly, not that first day, and I remember being grateful for that more than I could have explained to anyone at the time. He asked a few ordinary questions, where I was from, how long I'd lived in the duplex, and I gave him careful, edited answers, the kind I'd gotten used to giving anyone who asked about my family. He didn't press for more. When he left that afternoon, he handed me a business card and said simply that if anything else needed fixing, I shouldn't hesitate to call, and if nothing ever did, that was fine too. It took me 4 months to call him again, and when I finally did, it wasn't about anything broken. We'd run into each other twice more by then. Once at a hardware store on the west side of town, of all places, and once at a farmer's market downtown on a Saturday morning, both times exchanging a few minutes of easy, unhurried conversation that left me thinking about him longer than I meant to. The third time, I called first. We had coffee that Sunday, and I decided, somewhere in the middle of it, that he deserved honesty more than he deserved my usual careful evasions. I told him some of it, not all of it, but enough, that my family and I were estranged, that it had to do with my grandmother, that I didn't like talking about it and probably wouldn't, not for a long while, maybe not ever completely. He was quiet for a moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on its saucer. A small, unhurried gesture that reminded me, absurdly, painfully, of Opal doing the exact same thing at her kitchen table on all those quiet Sunday afternoons I still missed more than I let myself admit out loud. Then he said something I have carried with me ever since. "I'm not looking for the version of you that's finished healing. I'll take whatever version shows up." Nobody had ever said anything like that to me before. Not a single person in my life up to that point had ever simply accepted the shape of my grief without trying to smooth it, explain it, or hurry me past it. My mother had always wanted my sadness tidied up quickly, kept out of sight of the neighbors. My father had always wanted it explained in terms he found reasonable. Adam wanted neither of those things. He wanted, as far as I could tell, only to sit across a table from me and let me be exactly as complicated as I actually was. We were married 2 years later, in a small ceremony in a friend's backyard, with almost none of my blood relatives present. And it remains, to this day, one of the happiest afternoons of my entire life. My Aunt Deb came, driving up alone from Bardstown without telling anyone else in the family where she'd gone for the weekend. She stood near the back during the ceremony and cried through most of it, and afterwards she hugged me for a long time and told me Opal would have loved the whole afternoon, every ordinary, unpolished piece of it. The mismatched folding chairs and the store-bought cake, and the string lights Adam had hung himself between 2 oak trees. Casey was born 3 years after that, on a humid morning in June, and I remember looking down at her small, furious, red face in the hospital and feeling something settle inside me that I hadn't realized was still unsettled. Adam held both of us for a long time that first night, saying almost nothing, the way he tended to say the most important things without needing very many words at all. We built a life together in the years that followed that looked, from the outside, almost defiantly ordinary. Soccer practices, grocery runs, a leaking gutter he fixed himself every autumn without being asked. It was the kind of ordinary I had once been taught, without ever being told so directly, that I didn't deserve, and it became, slowly, and without any single dramatic turning point, the thing I was proudest of in my entire life. All of that, the 15 years of it compressed and rushing, came back to me in the span of maybe 4 or 5 seconds. Standing in my own doorway with my parents and my brother waiting on the porch in the fading evening light. It is a strange thing, how quickly a whole decade and a half can move through a person's mind, while the world outside stays perfectly still. I looked at my father again, really looked at him this time, past the initial shock of seeing him at all. He had lost weight since I'd last seen him, weight he hadn't needed to lose, and the confidence that used to precede him into every room he'd ever walked into had gone somewhere I couldn't locate in his posture anymore. My mother's hands, I noticed, were trembling slightly where they gripped the edge of her coat. A small detail she would have hated for me to see. I did not forgive them in that moment. I want to be honest about that, because so much of what people expect from stories like mine is a swift, satisfying softening, a reunion scored like the end of a movie, the kind where a hard knock on a door dissolves 15 years of hurt in a single warm embrace. That isn't what happened. What happened was quieter, and far more careful than that. And it would take much longer to unfold than any of the 3 of them standing on my porch that night could possibly have imagined. Why now, I asked. After 15 years. Why tonight? Judith opened her mouth and then closed it again, some explanation dying before it could fully form. Walter looked down at the hat in his hands. It was Grant who finally spoke, the first words he'd offered since arriving, his voice smaller than I remembered it, stripped of the easy confidence he'd always carried at the store. "The store's in trouble," he said. "Bad trouble. We didn't know who else to call." I studied him as he said it, and something in the careful way he avoided my eyes, the same way he had avoided them 15 years earlier standing in that living room while our parents disowned me, sent a small, cold current of suspicion through me that I couldn't yet name or justify. A feeling I recognized from my own work, the particular quiet of somebody choosing their words with more care than the situation seemed to call for. I had spent enough years by then reading the small, unconscious signals people gave off when they weren't telling the whole story. Grant was giving off every one of them. I did not owe these 3 people anything. I want to be clear about that because I was clear about it with myself. Standing there in my own doorway with my professional training and 15 years of hard-won boundaries firmly in place, I had spent my entire career telling other people's children exactly that, in exactly those words, when they called me racked with guilt over an aging parent who had never once earned the guilt they carried. But I also understood, in the same instant, that I would not be able to live with myself if I turned 3 people away from my porch on a dark evening, at least without understanding fully what had brought them there, and what, if anything, had finally made them desperate enough to come. "Come in," I said finally. "But I want the whole truth. All of it. Not the version that makes anyone look better than they are." They filed past me into the house, Walter first, then Judith, then Grant last, still not quite meeting my eyes. As he passed, I noticed him glance briefly toward the kitchen, toward the hallway, toward anywhere that wasn't my face, and I found myself thinking, not for the first time that evening, that whatever had truly brought my family to my door that night, I suspected my brother knew far more about it than either of our parents did. Adam met us in the hallway, wiping sawdust from his hands with a rag, and I watched him take in the scene with the same steady calm he brought to everything. No visible surprise on his face, even though I knew, better than anyone, exactly how surprised he had to be. He had heard the whole story of my family only in careful, incomplete pieces over the years, offered slowly, on my own timeline, never once pressed for more than I was ready to give. He looked at me for a brief moment, a silent question passing between us, and I gave him the smallest nod, enough to tell him I was steady enough to handle whatever came next, at least for now. "I'll put on some coffee," he said simply, and disappeared toward the kitchen, giving the four of us the room we needed without ever making it feel like he was leaving me alone with them. I led my parents and my brother into the living room, the same room where Casey had done her homework at the coffee table for a decade, where Adam and I had spent countless ordinary evenings that owed nothing at all to the family sitting stiffly on my couch now. I sat down across from them, deliberately choosing the chair rather than the space beside anyone. And I waited, the way I had learned to wait in 100 difficult family meetings that were not my own, for someone to finally tell me the truth. I led them into the living room, poured water for everyone since nobody seemed steady enough for coffee yet, and watched carefully where each of them chose to sit. Walter and Judith took the couch together, close, the way they always used to sit at church, shoulders nearly touching. Grant took the armchair furthest from the lamp, half in shadow. Exactly the way he'd positioned himself in that living room 15 years ago, while our parents told me I was no longer their daughter. My training has taught me to listen for what people don't say as carefully as I listen for what they do. Sitting there waiting for someone to begin, I reminded myself of that, and I settled in to listen for both. "Start from the beginning," I said. "All of it." Walter cleared his throat, glanced once at Grant, and began talking about numbers before he ever got to feelings, which somehow felt exactly like him even after 15 years apart. And that was how the second part of this story began. Not with an apology, but with a spreadsheet nobody in the room fully understood yet. Adam brought in a tray of coffee cups nobody had asked for, and set it quietly on the side table before retreating to the kitchen doorway, close enough to hear if I needed him, far enough to leave the conversation entirely mine to steer. I appreciated that about him more in that single moment than I had in years of ordinary mornings together. I looked around the room while Walter gathered himself to speak, taking in the small, telling details I had learned, professionally, to notice without seeming to. My father's shoes were older than anything else he was wearing. The leather cracked along the crease where his foot bent, the kind of detail a proud man let slide only when there truly wasn't money left over for replacing it. My mother's wedding ring had been reset at some point, the stone smaller than the one I remembered from childhood, likely sold and replaced with something more modest during a leaner year I'd never been told about. Grant's watch, by contrast, looked new, expensive, entirely out of step with a family supposedly on the edge of losing everything. I filed that detail away without comment. "The short version," Walter said, "is that the store owes more than it's worth. We're behind on the mortgage on the building. We're behind on 2 supplier accounts. The bank called last week and used the word foreclosure, and I don't think they were exaggerating to scare us." "How much?" I asked again, more firmly this time. "Exactly." Walter looked at Judith. Judith looked at Grant. Grant looked at the carpet. "We're not entirely sure," Walter admitted, and something in his voice cracked slightly on the word entirely, an admission that clearly cost him. "Grant's handled most of the books the last several years. I stepped back from that side of things. I turned toward my brother." "How much, Grant?" "It's complicated," he said. "There's more than one loan. Some of it's tangled up with the building itself, some of it's separate. Give me a number." He hesitated long enough that I understood, before he said anything else, that whatever number came out of his mouth next would not be the whole truth. "Somewhere around 200,000, he finally said, not quite meeting my eyes. Give or take. I had spent enough years by then reading financial documents for a living to recognize the particular shape of an estimate someone was rounding down. Give or take, in my professional experience, rarely meant what it claimed to mean. It usually meant the real number was worse, and the person saying it out loud simply wasn't ready yet to hear how much worse. "And you need me to give you $200,000, I said slowly. "After 15 years of not speaking to me." "We need help," my mother said, her voice tight. "You're the only one with the means to. I'm the only one you cut off." I said, 15 years ago, in your living room, you told me I was no longer your daughter. Now you're in mine, asking for money." Nobody answered that directly. Judith's hands twisted together in her lap. Walter stared at a spot on the rug somewhere between his shoes and mine. "We were wrong," Walter said finally, quietly. The closest thing to an apology I had heard from him in 15 years. "About a lot of it. I know that now. I wanted, badly, to believe him. Some old, tired part of me wanted nothing more than to hand over whatever they needed and let the whole exhausting weight of the last 15 years finally set itself down. But another part of me, the part trained by years of watching families in crisis reach for the nearest available person, the moment their carefully maintained illusions collapsed, held firm. "I'm not writing a check tonight," I said. "Not for $200,000, and not for a number nobody in this room seems entirely sure of. If you want my help, I need the real number, the real accounts, and the real reason this happened. Every piece of it, not just the pieces that make anyone in this room look better than they are. Tonight isn't the night for that. But soon, before the bank makes the decision for all of us." Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a small motion I might have missed if I hadn't spent years learning to watch for exactly that kind of flinch in people who weren't telling me everything. He recovered quickly, nodding along with what I'd said as though he agreed completely. But the recovery itself told me something. People who have nothing to hide rarely need a full second to arrange their face into agreement. Outside, through the front window, I could see the streetlight flicker on as the evening finally settled fully into dark. And for a moment none of us said anything at all, the silence stretching out long enough that I could hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen and, somewhere upstairs, the faint creak of Adam moving quietly around so as not to intrude on a conversation he understood, without needing to be told, was not yet his to enter. "That's fair," Walter said, before Grant could offer anything else. "More than fair, honestly. We'll get you whatever you need to see." He looked, for just a moment, like the version of him I remembered from childhood, tired and human rather than certain of everything, and something in me softened slightly despite every hard-won instinct telling me to keep my guard exactly where it was. Judith said nothing more that night. She sat very still on the couch beside my father, her water glass untouched on the table in front of her, and I noticed, watching her, that she had not once looked directly at me since walking through my door. 15 years earlier, she had been the one who delivered the final, unanswerable line that ended our relationship. Tonight, she seemed to have run entirely out of lines to deliver, and the silence coming from her felt, somehow, heavier than anything she might have said instead. I drove to Bardstown the following Tuesday, alone, without telling my parents I was coming. Adam offered to come with me, and part of me wanted him there badly, but I told him I needed to see the town, and the store, and whatever remained of my old life, without an audience, even a kind one. The drive took just under 4 hours, most of it along the same interstate I'd taken 15 years earlier in the opposite direction, hauling everything I owned in the back of a Honda Civic that had long since been traded in for something more practical. The landscape hadn't changed much. Rolling bluegrass pastures gave way slowly to smaller towns with water towers painted in faded school colors, then finally to the exit sign for Bardstown itself, a name I hadn't said out loud in years without some old ache rising up behind it. Main Street looked smaller than I remembered, The way childhood places always do when you return to them as an adult, the building somehow both familiar and strange all at once. But it also looked genuinely tired in a way that had nothing to do with my memory playing tricks or the natural shrinking of childhood landmarks. Half the storefronts I remembered had been replaced by others. A vape shop where the old shoe repair used to be. A nail salon in the space that had once housed a bakery my mother swore by. And there, on the corner where it had always stood, was Callaway Feed and Hardware. The sign faded almost to illegibility, one of the 2 front windows covered from the inside with brown paper. A pickup truck rattled past, its bed loaded with lumber. And for a strange, suspended moment, I felt 15 years old again, waiting on this exact corner for my father to lock up the store at closing time, before any of what came later had happened to any of us. I parked across the street and sat in my car for a long moment before I found the nerve to go in. When I finally did, the bell over the door gave the same tired jingle I remembered from childhood, but the inside of the store told a very different story than the one I'd grown up in. Whole sections of shelving stood half empty. A layer of dust had settled over displays that clearly hadn't been restocked in some time. An employee I didn't recognize, young, maybe 22, glanced up from behind the register and offered a tired nod before returning to whatever he'd been doing on his phone. I wandered the aisles slowly, running my hand along shelving my great-grandfather had built with his own hands, the wood worn smooth in places from decades of customers reaching past each other for nails and washers, trying to reconcile the store in front of me with the one that had once seemed, to my entire childhood self, permanent and unshakable, a fixed point in the world that would always be exactly where I'd left it. It felt standing there, like visiting the body of something I used to know well after all the life had already gone out of it. Outside, on the sidewalk, I ran into Mrs. Denny, older now, moving more slowly, but still recognizably herself. She startled slightly at the sight of me, then softened. "Renee Callaway," she said. "It's been a long time." We talked for a few minutes, careful, surface-level conversation about her grandchildren and the unusually wet spring. And then, almost as an afterthought, the way the most important things in a small town always seem to arrive almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that everyone had been talking about the store's troubles for the better part of a year. "Your brother's been in and out of the bank more than a man ought to be comfortable with," she said, lowering her voice slightly. The old habit of small-town discretion, even while delivering gossip, nobody had sworn her to keep quiet about. "New truck a while back, too. Nice one. Folks talk. You know how it is here. Always has been." I thanked her, said goodbye, and stood alone on that sidewalk for a long moment after she'd gone, turning her words over carefully, filing them away next to the expensive watch and the rounded-down number, building piece by piece. A picture I wasn't ready yet to fully believe. I walked the rest of Main Street slowly before I left, past the old First Baptist building where my mother had once run the Christmas pageant with the precision of a general, past the community college annex where I'd taken my very first classes toward the degree that eventually cost me my family. I stopped in front of the building that used to house the diner where Opal and I had eaten lunch most Sundays after church. Now a cell phone repair shop with a flickering neon sign in the window. Nothing stays the way you left it, I thought. Standing there, not towns, not people, not even grief, which had changed shape so many times over the years that I sometimes barely recognized it anymore as the same thing that had once flattened me completely before I left town. I drove past the cemetery where Opal was buried, though I didn't stop. Not that day. I told myself I didn't have time, that I needed to get back to Nashville before Casey called to check in. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. I wasn't ready yet to stand at that grave again with everything I was starting to suspect about my family swirling unresolved in my chest. I wanted answers first. She deserved that much before I brought her any more unfinished business. I drove home with the radio off the entire way, the 4 hours passing in a blur of half-formed theories and old, resurfacing anger. And by the time I pulled into my own driveway that evening, I had already decided what I needed to do next. 3 days after my trip to Bardstown, I called my father and asked him, plainly, to gather every bank statement, loan document, and account record he could find for the store, going back at least 5 years. I told him I wasn't asking as his daughter. I was asking as someone who had spent her entire career learning to read exactly this kind of paperwork. And if he wanted my help, this was the price of admission. There was a brief pause on the line before he answered. The sound of him setting something down, maybe a cup of coffee, maybe the newspaper he still read every morning out of habit. And then he agreed faster than I expected, which told me something on its own. A man with nothing to hide agrees to transparency easily. A man protecting someone else's secret usually hesitates, at least for a moment, weighing what compliance might expose. Walter didn't hesitate. Whatever Grant had been doing, I suspected my father genuinely didn't know the full shape of it yet. The documents arrived by mail 4 days later, a thick manila envelope stuffed with statements in no particular order. Some crumpled, some clearly pulled from a filing cabinet in a hurry. The kind of disorganization that told its own story about how loosely the finances had actually been managed in the years since I had last had any window into them at all. I spent an entire Saturday at my kitchen table, coffee going cold beside me for the second time in as many weeks, sorting them by date, by account, by lender, the same methodical process I used almost weekly in my actual job when a client's adult child suspected something similar happening to an aging parent's estate. What I found took my breath away, not because it was especially sophisticated, but because of how blatant it was once laid out chronologically, the kind of pattern that would have taken a bank examiner all of 10 minutes to flag if anyone in the family had ever thought to ask one to look. Over the previous 4 years, 3 separate loans had been taken out against the store's building and inventory, each one larger than the last, each one requiring Walter's signature as the store's legal owner, but arranged, processed, and dispersed through accounts Grant alone controlled. The most recent loan, taken out only 8 months earlier, was nearly double the size of the first. None of these loans had ever been discussed at a family level, as far as I could tell. There was no mention of them in any of my parents' correspondence, no sign that Judith had any idea the debt had grown this large this quickly. Cross-referencing dates against the town gossip, Mrs. Denny had handed me so casually on the sidewalk, I found that the newest, largest loan lined up almost exactly with the timeline of Grant's new truck, down to the same week. A coincidence I found difficult to accept as anything other than exactly what it appeared to be. I sat back in my chair for a long moment, staring at the spread of paper across my kitchen table, feeling something colder settle into my chest than simple anger. This wasn't a family business quietly struggling under the weight of a difficult economy, the story Walter had offered so readily on my couch a week earlier. This looked increasingly like one person systematically siphoning value out of a shared family asset, while the rest of the family remained almost entirely in the dark about what was happening to something that had once belonged, at least in theory, to all of us, including, I realized with a small, bitter jolt, to me. Before that particular door had been closed to me 15 years before any of these loans were ever signed. I thought about the version of events Grant had offered in my living room only a week earlier. Vague, apologetic, careful never to name a specific figure. I thought about his watch. I thought about the truck. And I understood, sitting there at my own kitchen table with the evidence spread out in front of me like an indictment, that whatever conversation came next between my brother and me was going to be far harder than anything I'd said to my parents so far. Adam came in around dusk, took one look at my face, and pulled out the chair across from me without a word, letting me talk it through out loud the way I sometimes needed to before I could fully believe something I'd already proven to myself on paper. I walked him through the loans one at a time, the dates, the signatures, the way the numbers climbed steadily upward each time, and he listened the whole way through without interrupting, the way he always did when something mattered enough to me to deserve his full attention. "You sound like you already know what this is," he said finally. "I know what it looks like in every other family I've ever worked with," I told him. I just never expected to be looking at it in my own handwriting, so to speak. I called Diane Foss again that evening, the same attorney who had guided me 15 years earlier through the first version of this exact nightmare, still practicing 2 counties over, her voice instantly familiar even after all this time, and I read her the rough shape of what I'd found. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then she said something that stayed with me for days afterward. "It sounds like history repeating itself with a different name attached to the signature line," she said. "Sometimes it isn't the person you were watching who does the damage. It's the one standing quietly in the corner the whole time you were watching someone else." I asked Grant to meet me alone, without our parents present, at a coffee shop halfway between Nashville and Bardstown, a neutral, unremarkable place off the interstate where neither of us was likely to run into anyone we knew. He arrived a full 15 minutes late that afternoon, sliding into the booth across from me with the same practiced, easy smile he'd worn behind the register the day I'd walked past him on my way to find our father. A smile I now recognized, looking back on years of hindsight, as something closer to a well-rehearsed performance than genuine warmth, the kind salesmen use on customers they've already decided not to fully trust. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I ordered a black coffee I didn't really want, mostly to give my hands something to do, and I laid the loan documents on the table between us, one at a time, in chronological order, and watched his face carefully as each one landed. "Explain these," I said. He glanced down at them, then back up at me, and I watched him reach, almost visibly, for an explanation that would hold. "Business has been rough," he said. "You know how it is with a small operation like ours. Supply costs went up. We had to borrow to keep the shelves stocked. 3 loans in 4 years, each one bigger than the last, all routed through accounts you controlled, none of them ever mentioned to Mom or Dad." He turned his coffee cup a half circle on the table, not quite meeting my eyes. "I didn't want to worry them," he said, and something in his voice cracked slightly, a hairline fracture in the smooth surface he'd been presenting since he first sat down. "Dad's not as sharp with numbers as he used to be. I was trying to handle it so he wouldn't have to. And the truck." He looked away, out the window, toward the parking lot. "I needed something reliable for making deliveries. Grant." I kept my voice level, deliberately level, the same voice I used professionally with families who were still, even in the face of overwhelming evidence laid out plainly in front of them, protecting a story they weren't ready to let go of. I've spent 15 years learning exactly what it looks like when someone tries to explain away a pattern like this one. This isn't a small business having a rough year. This is years of decisions, made carefully, kept quiet from the 2 people who actually own that store. His jaw tightened, the same small, involuntary motion I'd noticed in my living room the week before. "You don't get to walk back into this family after 15 years and start acting like you know everything," he snapped. And for a moment I saw something underneath the practiced calm, something sharper and more defensive than I expected. "You weren't there. You don't know what it's been like, trying to hold that place together while everyone else moved on with their lives." "I wasn't there," I agreed quietly. "Because you all made very sure of that. I remember exactly how that happened." "Grant," I remember you standing in the corner of that living room, not saying a single word while our parents told me I was no longer their daughter. I've wondered for 15 years what you were thinking in that moment. What could have possibly kept you so quiet while your own sister was being erased from the family in front of you? I'm starting to understand it a little better now, and I don't think I like where that understanding is heading. He stood up so abruptly his coffee nearly tipped, muttered something about needing to get back, and left before I could say anything else, the bell over the shop door ringing sharply behind him. I sat alone in that booth for a long time afterward, gathering the loan documents back into their folder, feeling less triumphant than I expected to feel, and considerably more certain than I had been an hour earlier that my brother was hiding something far larger than a struggling business. I drove home slowly that afternoon, taking the back roads instead of the interstate, needing the extra time to sit with everything the conversation had confirmed and everything it had left unanswered. Grant had not denied the loans. He had not offered a single coherent explanation for the truck, or for routing every transaction through accounts our parents never saw. What he had offered, instead, was anger, quick and sharp, the particular anger of someone who understands they are cornered and has decided attack is safer than explanation. I thought about the years I'd spent imagining what might have happened differently if Grant had simply spoken up that night in our parents' living room. If he had said even one sentence in my defense while I stood there absorbing the worst moment of my life. I had always assumed his silence came from cowardice, or indifference, or simple loyalty to the parents who had raised him to believe the family name mattered more than almost anything else. Sitting in traffic on the drive home, replaying the flash of genuine fear I'd seen cross his face at that coffee shop, I began to consider for the first time a colder possibility. Perhaps his silence that night hadn't been cowardice at all. Perhaps it had been convenience. I called Adam from the car to tell him I was on my way home, and I heard myself say something out loud that I hadn't fully allowed myself to think yet. I don't think Grant just stayed quiet 15 years ago, I told him. I think he might have wanted me gone. A week after the coffee shop, I got a call from a woman named Carol Whitfield, who had kept the store's books for almost 30 years before retiring not long after I left Bardstown. She'd heard, through the same efficient small-town channels that had once carried my own story to every corner of the county, that I'd been asking questions. And she said she thought it was time somebody who actually remembered the full picture told me the truth. We met at her home on the edge of town, a tidy brick ranch with a garden that clearly consumed most of her retirement. Rows of tomatoes and marigolds planted with the same careful precision I imagined she'd once brought to 30 years of balanced ledgers. And she poured 2 glasses of sweet tea before sitting down across from me at her kitchen table, with the particular seriousness of someone who has been waiting a long time to finally say something out loud. I always felt bad about what happened to you, she said, folding her hands together on the table in front of her like she was steadying herself for something she'd rehearsed more than once in the years since. I should have said something back then. I didn't, and I've regretted it for 15 years. I told myself it wasn't my business to get involved in a family's private matters. I'm not sure I believe that excuse anymore, not at my age. Said something about what? A cardinal landed briefly on the feeder outside her kitchen window, pecked at nothing in particular, and flew off again. And Carol watched it go before she finally spoke, as though she needed one more moment of quiet before committing herself to what came next. She was quiet a beat longer, turning her glass slowly on its coaster. Your brother came to see me. Not long after that investigator started asking around about your grandmother's paperwork. He was worried, real worried. Not about Opal exactly, about the store. He'd already started borrowing against it by then. Small amounts, nothing like what came later, but enough that an outside audit would have raised questions he wasn't ready to answer. I felt something go very still and very cold in my chest. A stillness I recognized from other rooms, other kitchen tables, other moments in my career when a family's carefully maintained story had begun, quietly, to come apart. "What are you saying, Carol?" "I'm saying your brother didn't just stay quiet while your parents cut you off," she said, meeting my eyes directly. Her voice steady, even though I could tell the steadiness was costing her something. "He pushed for it, sat right in that back office, and told your father the family needed to move fast, cut ties clean, before the investigation dragged on long enough to put the whole business under a microscope. He made it sound like protecting the family name, like it was the only sensible thing left to do. I always wondered, quietly, whether he was really protecting something else entirely, something a lot closer to home than the Calloway reputation." I sat in her kitchen for a long time after that, the sweet tea going warm and untouched in my hand. The garden outside her window, blurring slightly at the edges, as I tried to fit this new piece into everything I already understood about that spring. 15 years. I had believed my family's cruelty toward me had been about reputation, about the town's opinion, about my parents' rigid, unbending idea of what a good family looked like from the outside. Some of that was certainly true, but underneath it, apparently, had been something far more calculated. My brother hadn't simply failed to defend me. He had actively engineered my removal from the family, at exactly the moment it became convenient for him to do so. And everyone else in that living room, including me, had been too consumed by their own grief and fear to notice the hand quietly guiding events from the corner of the room. I thanked Carol for her honesty, and I drove home that evening with a version of the story sitting in my chest that felt heavier, somehow, than everything I had already been carrying. It is one thing to be cast out of your family for standing up for someone you loved. It is another thing entirely to learn that your own brother had a hand in orchestrating it, quietly, for reasons that had nothing at all to do with protecting anyone but himself. Before I left, Carol walked me to the door and paused there for a moment, her hand resting on the frame. "Your grandmother always spoke so highly of you," she said. "Prouder of you than of either of your parents, if I'm honest. Though she never would have said it that plainly out loud. She used to tell me you were the only one in that family who ever asked her real questions instead of just checking in on her the way you'd check in on a piece of property." That small, simple detail stayed with me the entire long drive home through the darkening countryside, turning itself over in my mind alongside everything else Carol had told me. I thought about the fog that had passed behind Opal's eyes when I'd asked her, years ago, whether she remembered signing that first altered document. I thought about the quiet, careful trust she'd described in that sunlit room at the assisted living facility, the trust she'd placed in someone other than Harlan, someone the rest of the family had never known to look for. And I began to wonder, driving through the darkening Kentucky countryside with my headlights cutting narrow paths through the dusk, how many more pieces of this story my grandmother had understood, quietly, long before any of the rest of us caught up to her. The call came on a Wednesday evening, while I was helping my parents at their kitchen table sort through the rest of the paperwork Diane Foss had asked to review before agreeing to advise them further. I had driven up that day specifically to help, not out of forgiveness exactly, but out of something closer to professional instinct. The same instinct that had always pulled me toward people standing at the edge of a financial cliff they didn't fully understand yet. The kitchen clock ticked audibly in the quiet that had settled over the table just before the phone rang. The three of us bent over receipts and bank letters, and I remember thinking, in the half-second before Walter reached for it, that I had not sat in this particular silence with my parents in 15 years. Walter answered on the second ring, and I watched his face change almost instantly, color draining from it in a way I recognized from countless other kitchens, other families, other calls that arrived exactly like this one, always somehow both expected and impossible to fully prepare for. He listened for nearly a full minute without saying anything, then set the phone down slowly, as though it had grown heavier in his hand. That was the bank, he said. They're moving to foreclose. 30 days, unless we can bring the account current or refinance the whole balance, which they've made clear they have no interest in doing given the payment history. Judith made a small, sharp sound and pressed her hand against her mouth. Her eyes suddenly bright with tears. She seemed determined not to let fall in front of me. My father sat down heavily in the chair across from me, staring at a spot on the table, his hands trembling slightly in a way that had nothing to do with age. 30 days, he repeated, mostly to himself, staring down at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else entirely. 40 years, and it comes down to 30 days. I looked around the kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd eaten breakfast every morning of my childhood, the same yellow curtains still hanging over the sink after all these years, faded now from decades of afternoon sun, and felt something complicated move through me. Grief and anger tangled together in a way I couldn't fully untangle in the moment. These were the same two people who had told me, in a living room not far from where we now sat, that disowning me was the smartest decision they would ever make, and yet, watching my father's hands shake against the kitchen table, I couldn't summon the satisfaction I might once have imagined feeling at a moment like this. Grant had not come to the house that evening. I noticed his absence immediately. The empty chair at the table where he should have been sitting if this was truly a family crisis he intended to face honestly alongside the rest of us. Nobody mentioned it out loud, but I saw my mother glance at the empty chair more than once, an unspoken question forming behind her eyes that she didn't yet seem ready to ask out loud. Not in front of me, maybe not even fully in front of herself. I stayed late that night, helping Walter organize the documents Diane would need for their first meeting. Walking Judith through, gently, what a foreclosure timeline actually looked like in practical terms. What deadlines mattered most. What could still be salvaged with careful, immediate action, and what likely couldn't be salvaged at all no matter what anyone did now. I want to be honest about why I stayed. It wasn't because I had forgiven them, not yet, not fully. It was because I had spent my entire career watching what happened to elderly people when a financial crisis arrived and nobody stepped in to help them understand it clearly. And some part of me, trained now by years of professional practice, simply couldn't sit at that table and watch two frightened, aging people drown in paperwork they didn't know how to read. Before I left that night, my mother walked me to my car. Something she hadn't done in 15 years. She stood there for a long moment in the cold, arms wrapped around herself, and finally said quietly, "Thank you for staying tonight." The first thing resembling gratitude I had heard from her since I was a much younger woman, standing in a very different kitchen, in a very different version of this same family. I drove home that night thinking less about the foreclosure notice and more about the empty chair at the table, the one Grant hadn't bothered to fill even as the walls closed in around the family business he'd spent years quietly draining. I thought about Carol Whitfield's kitchen and the stories she'd told me there, and I wondered whether my parents had any real idea yet how much of tonight's crisis traced directly back to their favored son rather than to the vague, faceless economy Walter kept invoking as an explanation. I called Adam from the driveway before going inside, needing to hear his voice before I tried to sleep. I told him about the 30-day notice, about my mother's small, unfamiliar gratitude, about the strange, unwelcome tenderness I'd felt. Watching my father's hands shake over paperwork he could no longer make sense of alone. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel right now, I admitted. Part of me still wants them to hurt the way I hurt. Another part of me can't stand watching them hurt at all. I don't know how to hold both of those things at the same time. You don't have to know yet, Adam said simply. His voice steady the way it always was when I most needed steadiness and least knew how to ask for it directly. You've got 30 days. Nobody's asking you to solve 15 years of this in one night, least of all me. Grant showed up at my house at nearly 11 o'clock that night, 3 days after the foreclosure call, without warning, without calling ahead, standing on the same porch where our parents had stood weeks earlier. When I opened the door, I barely recognized him for a moment. Whatever composure he'd carried through our conversation at the coffee shop was entirely gone. His eyes were red-rimmed, his shirt wrinkled as though he'd been wearing it for days, and his hands shook slightly as he stood there in the porch light. "Can I come in?" he said. Not quite a question. "I need to tell you something, and I don't think I can say it standing on your doorstep." The porch light caught deep circles under his eyes, a rawness to his expression I hadn't seen on him since we were children. Adam was already in bed, and Casey was home from school for the weekend, asleep upstairs, the house quiet around us. I led Grant into the kitchen instead of the living room, some instinct telling me this conversation needed a smaller, quieter space than the one where our parents had made their case weeks before. He sat down at my kitchen table and put his head in his hands for a long moment before he spoke. "The bank's not the only one calling," he said finally, his voice muffled. "There's a private lender, too. From the last loan, the big one. They're threatening to come after me personally, not just the business. My house, my accounts, everything. Grant." He looked up at me, and something in his face had finally, completely cracked open. "I did this," he said. "All of it, not Dad, not some bad market. Me. I've been borrowing against that store for 4 years, telling myself every single time it was temporary that I'd pay it back before anyone noticed. And every single time I just borrowed more instead. Why, I asked, keeping my voice level, though my heart was pounding. "I don't even fully know anymore," he said. "It started small, an investment that didn't pan out. Then I borrowed more to cover the first loan. Told myself I just needed a little more time. Then the truck, because I felt like I deserved something after years of working for a business I was terrified was going to be worth nothing by the time it was actually mine." He laughed, a short, bitter sound with no humor in it at all. "That's the part that kills me. I did all of this trying to protect something that might not have even survived long enough for me to inherit it clean." I sat down across from him, quiet, letting him get to the rest of it in his own time. Though this particular unraveling felt very different sitting this close to it. "There's something else," he said, and his voice dropped even lower. 15 years ago, when you called about Grandma, I knew, even then, that if the state started digging into how our finances worked, they might find the first loan too. It was small back then, barely anything, but it was already there. I told Dad we needed to move fast, cut you off clean, before anyone started looking too closely at anything else in this family. I told myself I was protecting the family name. I wasn't. I was protecting myself. And I let everyone believe it was about protecting Grandma's dignity instead. The kitchen was silent for a long moment. I thought about Carol Whitfield's careful, apologetic voice in her own kitchen weeks earlier, confirming almost exactly what my brother was now confessing to me himself, unprompted, at nearly midnight, with nowhere left to hide from it. "I'm sorry," Grant said, and for the first time in 15 years, I believed he actually meant it. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I just couldn't let you keep thinking it was only ever about Grandma. I didn't say anything for a long moment. I thought about the 26-year-old version of my brother, standing silent in the corner of our parents' living room. And I tried, honestly tried, to reconcile that memory with the exhausted, broken man sitting across my kitchen table now, confessing at midnight because he'd finally run out of other places to hide. Some part of me wanted to reach across the table and comfort him the way I might have when we were children, before any of this, before either of us understood what our family was capable of doing to each other under enough pressure. Another part of me, the part that had spent 15 years building a life entirely without him, felt something colder, more guarded, unwilling to let one late-night confession undo a decade and a half of damage in a single conversation. "How much do you actually owe?" I asked finally. "The real number, not the one you gave me in my living room." He told me, and it was worse than the figure he'd offered before, considerably worse, close to $300,000 once every private loan and every hidden fee was accounted for. I wrote it down without reacting, the same clinical distance I brought to every difficult financial conversation in my professional life, though my hands, I noticed, were not entirely steady as I wrote. "Does Mom know? Does Dad know?" he said. "They think it's maybe half that." I couldn't bring myself to tell them the whole truth. I was still trying to figure out how to fix it quietly before anyone found out how bad it really was. You don't get to keep protecting yourself by managing what people know. Grant, not anymore. Not after everything that secrecy has already cost this family. I said it firmly, but not unkindly. The exact tone I used with clients who needed to hear a hard truth without being made to feel destroyed by it. "Tomorrow, you're going to sit down with Mom and Dad, and you're going to tell them everything you just told me. All of it. The loans, the truck, and what you did 15 years ago. I won't do it for you, and I won't let you keep hiding behind half-truths while everyone else scrambles to clean up a mess they don't even fully understand yet." He nodded slowly, wiping his face with the back of his hand, looking, for a moment, exactly like the frightened younger brother I remembered from childhood, rather than the man who had quietly orchestrated my exile from this family. It would be the beginning, though none of us understood it yet that night, of a much longer reckoning still waiting for all four of us. Grant kept his word. He drove to Bardstown the following afternoon and told our parents everything, the real number, the years of quiet borrowing, and, finally, the part I suspected would be hardest of all for him to say out loud, his role in pushing them to disown me 15 years earlier. I wasn't there for that conversation, and I deliberately chose not to be. Some things I had learned over years of professional practice needed to be said by the person who owed the apology without a mediator softening the blow or managing the room. I heard about it later, in pieces, first from Grant himself in a brief shaken phone call that evening, his voice hoarse, exhausted, the voice of a man who had spent an entire afternoon finally telling the truth after years of practiced avoidance. Then, more fully, I heard it from my mother, who called me 3 days later, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it in my entire life. "I didn't know," she said. Before I'd even finished saying hello, her words tumbling out fast, almost breathless, as though she'd been rehearsing them for 3 days and couldn't wait any longer to say them out loud. "About any of it, the loans, what Grant did 15 years ago, I want you to understand that we genuinely didn't know." "I believe you didn't know the full extent of the loans," I said carefully. "I'm less certain what to make of the rest." There was a long pause on the line. "We were wrong about you," she said finally. "Not just about the money, though God knows we were wrong about that too. We were wrong to believe, the way we believed it, that you had done something shameful by trying to protect your grandmother. We wanted so badly for it not to be true that we let your brother's version of events become the only version we allowed ourselves to hear. I walked to the kitchen window as she spoke, watching Adam in the backyard fixing a fence post that didn't strictly need fixing yet. The kind of small, unnecessary task he took on whenever he needed something to do with his hands while I worked through something difficult on the phone nearby. "Why now?" "Mom," I asked. "Why is this the moment it's finally becoming clear to you?" After everything, she was quiet again, and when she spoke, her voice had the particular rawness of someone admitting something they'd never planned to say out loud. "Because for 15 years, it was easier to believe you had betrayed us than to believe we had failed you," she said. "It's a terrible thing to admit about yourself, Renee. Choosing the version of events that lets you keep sleeping at night instead of the version that's actually true. I've done that for 15 years. I'm not proud of it." I sat with that admission for a long moment before responding, phone pressed to my ear in my quiet kitchen, turning it over the way I might turn over an unfamiliar document, checking it for the small tells that separate genuine reckoning from convenient performance. The tells I had spent an entire career learning to notice in other people's difficult, overdue confessions. Something in her voice, exhausted and unpolished in a way I had rarely heard from her, told me this was closer to the former than the latter, though I understood even then that one honest phone call could not undo 15 years of silence on its own. I let the silence sit between us for a moment before I answered, choosing my words the way I would with any client's family finally ready to hear something difficult. "You didn't want to know," I said finally, gently but without softening the truth of it. "There's a difference between not knowing and not wanting to know. Mom, I think it's important that you understand which one this actually was." She didn't argue with me. She didn't offer an excuse or a justification, the way she once might have, quickly and reflexively, to protect the family's image even in private conversation. That silence, more than anything else she said that afternoon, was what finally convinced me something in her had genuinely shifted. We talked for a while longer, carefully, both of us picking our way through territory that had been closed off for 15 years. Neither of us pretending the conversation alone was enough to repair everything that had broken. She asked about Casey, hesitantly, as though she wasn't sure she'd earned the right to ask. And I told her, briefly, about nursing school, about the young woman my daughter had become almost entirely without a grandmother on my side of the family present to watch it happen. My mother was quiet for a long moment after that, and I understood, without her needing to say it outright, exactly how much that particular loss had cost her too, even if it was a loss she had brought entirely on herself. Before we hung up, she asked, tentatively, whether I would consider coming to Bardstown again soon, not to fix the finances this time, but simply to sit at the table and talk, all four of us, honestly, for the first time in longer than I could remember any of us managing it. I told her I would think about it. I realized after we'd hung up, the first time in 15 years I hadn't immediately said no. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long while after the call ended, staring out at my own backyard. At the bird feeder Opal had given me years earlier, still hanging from the same maple tree where Adam had installed it the week I moved in. I thought about how strange it was that the crisis threatening to destroy my family financially might also be the very thing finally forcing them to see me clearly, after 15 years of choosing not to. I didn't know yet whether that was a fair trade. I still don't know, some days, whether it was. I did go back to Bardstown the following weekend, this time with a specific purpose beyond simply sitting at a table with my family. Grant had asked if I would help him organize the loan paperwork properly. In preparation for the meeting Diane Foss had scheduled to discuss the family's options. And I agreed, partly out of professional habit and partly, I think, because working through documents together felt like safer ground than working through feelings. We spread the paperwork across the same kitchen table where Grant had once, years earlier, sat silent while our parents disowned me. An irony I noticed, but didn't mention out loud, though I caught him glancing at that same corner of the room more than once that afternoon, as though the memory of where he'd stood that night lived permanently in the floorboards now. Grant. More cooperative now than I had ever known him to be. Walked me through each loan, each account, each signature, answering my questions honestly for the first time since this whole ordeal began. It was during that long, methodical afternoon, cross-referencing dates across years of scattered paperwork spread out between coffee cups and an old family photo album nobody had bothered to move off the table, that I noticed something that stopped me cold. A name appeared, again and again, across nearly every significant financial document connected to our family for the better part of 2 decades. Not just Grant's recent loans, not just my father's original power of attorney for Opal, Harlan Pruitt's signature or his firm's letterhead, or a brief notation crediting his office with preparing a document, showed up on almost everything of consequence our family had ever signed. That fact, sitting there on its own, wasn't especially strange. Harlan had been our family's attorney for as long as I could remember, and small towns like Bardstown often ran on exactly this kind of concentrated trust. One lawyer handling generations of the same family's business without anyone thinking twice about it. What stopped me was a specific folder, tucked toward the back of an old filing box Grant had pulled down from a high shelf in the store's back office. Dusty. Clearly untouched in years. Labeled simply, in Harlan's own precise handwriting. Estate O. Calloway. Inside were several documents I had never seen before, related to Opal's estate after her death, none of which matched the version of events I understood. None of which mentioned anything about a separate trust or an independent arrangement of any kind. I sat very still at that kitchen table. The memory of Opal's voice rising up in my mind, clear and unmistakable, as clear as the afternoon she'd first said it to me in that sunlit room at the assisted living facility, her hand tight around mine. A friend from church helped me. Not Harlan. Never Harlan. Not for this. If Harlan hadn't handled whatever Opal had arranged to protect me, then what exactly had Harlan been handling instead? Quietly, for years, under the same trusted family name that had once seemed so far above suspicion in this town, and if there truly was some independent arrangement my grandmother had made, hidden from the rest of the family, hidden even from Harlan himself. Where was it now? And why? After everything that had already come apart in this family over the last several weeks, had nobody ever found it, or even thought to look? I looked up at Grant, who was still sorting papers, entirely unaware of the question now taking shape in my mind. I need to go see Harlan Pruitt, I told him. There's something about Grandma's estate I don't think any of us have ever actually seen. Grant looked up, surprised, and something crossed his face that I couldn't quite name. Not suspicion exactly. More like a faint, uneasy recognition. He handled all of that after she passed, he said slowly. I never really questioned it. Nobody did. He'd been our lawyer my whole life. Why would we have questioned him? That's exactly the question I keep asking myself. I said, why wouldn't we have? Everyone in this family trusted him completely, for decades, without ever once double-checking a single thing he told us. I thought about my own professional life. The countless times I had warned younger colleagues about exactly this pattern, the danger hiding inside long, comfortable trust. Families rarely got harmed by strangers walking in off the street. They got harmed, far more often, by the people who had been sitting at their table for so long that nobody thought to ask them a hard question anymore. It was a lesson I had built an entire career around, And it had taken me until that exact moment, sitting in my father's kitchen with a folder full of unfamiliar paperwork, to fully turn that same scrutiny on a man I had known since childhood. "Should I come with you?" Grant asked, setting down the papers in his hands, his full attention on me now in a way it rarely had been when we were younger. To see Pruitt, I considered it for a moment, then shook my head. "Not yet," I told him. "I think I need to hear whatever this is on my own first, before any of the rest of the family is in the room to react to it." Grant nodded, and for the first time since he'd shown up on my porch weeks earlier, I saw something on his face that looked less like fear and more like genuine trust. The quiet, uncomplicated kind siblings are supposed to carry for each other, the kind we had lost somewhere along the way and were only now, slowly, tentatively, beginning to rebuild. One honest conversation at a time, one shared folder of old paperwork at a time. I drove to Harlan Pruitt's office 2 long days later, my hands tighter on the steering wheel than I wanted to admit, the folder from Grant's back office sitting on the passenger seat like something that might combust if I looked at it too directly. My training had taught me to read documents, not people I'd known since childhood, and some part of me still wanted, badly, for there to be an innocent explanation waiting on the other side of that glass door with his name stenciled across it in gold. I had closed the loop on Grant that same morning, one last phone call to confirm he'd told our parents absolutely everything, no quiet omissions left standing. My brother was, for the first time in years, fully honest with our parents, and our family had begun, slowly and imperfectly, the long work of putting itself back together, one difficult conversation at a time. Now there was one more thread left to pull, the one Opal had warned me about years earlier without ever quite naming it. Sitting quietly at the edge of a story I thought I already fully understood, and I was the only one left who could pull it. The offices of Pruitt and Kessler occupied the 2nd floor of a restored brick building 2 blocks from the courthouse. The kind of space designed to project quiet, old-fashioned trustworthiness, dark wood paneling, framed diplomas, a leather chair that had clearly seen 4 decades of nervous clients. Harlan greeted me at the door himself, warmer than I expected, pulling me into a brief, familiar hug before I could decide whether I wanted one. His cologne the same one he'd worn to every Christmas party I could remember from childhood, unchanged across 3 decades. "Renee Calloway," he said, stepping back to look at me properly. "It's been far too long. I was sorry to hear about everything happening at the store. Your father's a good man. This whole mess must be difficult for all of you." His secretary, a woman I didn't recognize, someone new since I'd last set foot in this office as a much younger woman, brought in 2 cups of coffee on a small silver tray, and Harlan settled into the leather chair behind his desk with the easy confidence of a man who had conducted 1,000 conversations in this exact room, and expected this one to unfold no differently. He asked about Adam, about Casey, about how Nashville had treated me over the years. Questions that felt genuinely warm and, at the same time, carefully designed to keep the conversation moving in a direction he controlled. I let him settle into the comfortable rhythm of small talk for a few minutes. The weather, a mutual acquaintance's recent retirement, the price of lumber climbing again after a brief dip, before I finally brought out the folder I'd carried in from the car. He glanced at the folder, then back at my face, and something in his eyes sharpened slightly, a subtle recalibration I might not have caught if I hadn't spent years learning to watch for exactly that kind of shift in people sitting across a desk from me. "I wanted to ask you about my grandmother's estate," I said, specifically about a fund she'd always talked about, a pledge for Fielding House, and anything else connected to her final wishes that might not have made it into what the rest of the family has seen. Something shifted, briefly, behind Harlan's expression, so quick I almost missed it. Gone as fast as it appeared, replaced by the same easy, professional warmth he'd greeted me with at the door. "Your grandmother's estate was handled entirely appropriately," he said. "I can walk you through the general structure, of course, but a good deal of it falls under attorney-client privilege. Even now, I'm sure you understand." "I understand privilege," I said carefully. "I'm less clear on why an accounting of a deceased client's estate would need to stay hidden from her own granddaughter, particularly given everything else that's come to light about this family's finances recently." Harlan's smile didn't waver, but something in his posture straightened almost imperceptibly, the posture of a man recalculating. "These things take time to untangle properly," he said. "Estates, especially ones spanning multiple family interests, aren't always as simple as people assume from the outside. I'd hate to give you incomplete information and cause you unnecessary worry." I pressed a little further, asking specifically about the timeline of Opal's final years, about whether any documents had been prepared or amended in the months before her death. Harlan's answers grew steadily more general with each question, longer on reassurance and shorter on specifics, the practiced deflection of a man who had clearly given some version of this exact explanation before to someone at some point, and had refined it since. "I promise you, Renee, everything regarding your grandmother's estate was handled with the utmost care," he said, folding his hands on the desk in front of him. "I understand this is an emotional time for your family, with everything happening at the store. I'd hate for grief and financial stress to lead anyone toward suspicions that aren't warranted." "I'm not operating on suspicion," I said evenly. "I'm operating on a folder labeled with your own handwriting that doesn't match anything my grandmother ever told me about her own wishes." For just a moment, something almost like fear flickered across his face before the practiced warmth slid back into place. "I'll pull the full file and have my assistant send over whatever's appropriate to share," he said. "These things simply take a bit of time to compile properly, especially records this old." I left his office 20 minutes later with nothing concrete, no documents, no real answers, only a folder full of vague reassurances and a growing, unshakable certainty that Harlan Pruitt had spent that entire conversation working very hard to tell me as little as possible while appearing, at every moment, to be telling me everything, sitting in my car outside his office a long while afterward, engine off, hand still resting on the wheel, the street outside going quietly about its ordinary business. I thought again about Opal's words in that sunlit room years earlier. The careful, deliberate way she'd separated Harlan from whatever protection she'd arranged for me, as though she'd wanted to make absolutely certain I would remember it correctly someday, exactly when I needed to. A friend from church helped me. Not Harlan, never Harlan, not for this. I had believed, walking into that office an hour earlier, that I was there to ask questions and receive honest answers in return, the way any client's family reasonably expects to be treated by a trusted advisor. I left understanding something colder and more urgent instead, that I was, instead, going to have to find the truth myself, without his help, and possibly despite his active efforts to keep it from me entirely. In my line of work, I have a legal standing that most family members chasing down a suspicion don't have. Before I was disowned, I had been listed, briefly, as an authorized secondary contact on Opal's care records at the assisted living facility, added during the period when I was still visiting regularly, before anyone thought to remove my name. Facilities are required by state regulation to retain those records for a fixed number of years after a resident's death, and my professional credentials, built now over more than a decade of exactly this kind of work, gave me a legitimate pathway to formally request them. something an ordinary grieving granddaughter locked out of her own family might never have known to pursue. I submitted the request the same afternoon I left Harlan's office, filling out the paperwork at my kitchen table before I'd even taken off my coat, and the facility's records office, efficient in the unhurried way of institutions with nothing to hide, sent over a thick packet within the week, considerably faster than Harlan's own office had managed for a far simpler request. I spent an entire evening at my kitchen table cross-referencing dates, matching every document Harlan's office had ever produced regarding Opal's affairs against the facility's own internal notes on her cognitive assessments during those same final years. I worked slowly and carefully, the way I'd been trained to, resisting the urge to jump to conclusions before the paper trail actually supported them, laying each document out in careful chronological order across my kitchen table, until the shape of the timeline became impossible to ignore. What I found confirmed something I had feared since the moment I first walked into Harlan's office and watched his expression shift, however briefly, at the mention of my grandmother's estate. 2 separate documents bearing Opal's signature, both prepared by Pruitt and Kessler, were dated within days of assessments in her medical file, explicitly noting significant impairment. Moments when the facility's own staff had documented, in careful clinical language stripped of any emotion, that Opal was often confused about time, place, and the identity of people she should have recognized without a moment's hesitation. One of those documents was the addendum I had discovered years earlier, redirecting the Fielding House pledge into the store's accounts. The other was newer, dated less than a year before her death, a brief legal filing I had never seen before in my life, titled simply as an acknowledgement of distribution, listing the beneficiaries entitled to Opal's remaining estate once every other obligation had been settled. My name did not appear anywhere on it, not once, not in any capacity, as though I had never existed at all in the context of my own grandmother's final wishes. I read that page 4 times, slowly, deliberately, the way I might read a document I suspected of concealing something rather than one I trusted at face value, before the full weight of it finally settled into my chest. Whatever protection my grandmother had described to me in that sunlit room, whatever quiet arrangement she'd made through a friend from church rather than through Harlan, this document, drawn up under his letterhead, and dated during a period when the facility's own records showed her struggling to remember which season it was, made no mention of it whatsoever. Either the independent trust Opal had described to me had never actually existed outside of a confused, aging woman's hopeful imagination, or someone had worked very hard, over a period of years, to make sure it never officially appeared anywhere Harlan Pruitt's office controlled. I did not want to believe the second possibility. I wanted, badly, for there to be an innocent explanation, the same way I had wanted one 15 years earlier, standing in that back office listening to my father dismiss my concerns about a shaking signature. But I had learned over years of doing this exact kind of work for other families, that wanting an innocent explanation and finding one were very rarely the same thing, and that the only way forward was to keep looking, carefully, methodically. For whoever might still remember the truth, Harlan's paperwork seemed determined to erase. Late that evening, once the documents were finally sorted into some coherent order, I called Adam into the kitchen and walked him through everything I'd found, laying the documents side by side on the table the way I might for a client's family, forcing myself to stay clinical even as my hands trembled slightly turning the pages. He listened the whole way through in silence, the same patient attention he always gave me whenever something mattered enough to me to warrant it, and when I finished, he asked the one question I hadn't yet let myself ask out loud. Even privately, even in the safety of my own thoughts. If your name isn't on that distribution, and there's no sign of whatever trust Opal told you about, he said carefully, what happened to it? Trusts don't just disappear on their own. Somebody has to be managing it, or it never existed at all. I sat with that question for a long, quiet time after he asked it. The kitchen clock ticking softly in the background, staring down at the unfamiliar acknowledgement of distribution. Opal's wavering signature at the bottom of a page that erased me entirely from her final wishes. I thought about the church she'd attended every Sunday for over 50 years. The same small congregation where she'd found the friend she'd mentioned so carefully, so deliberately, in that sunlit room. If the answer wasn't in Harlan's files, I decided then it was time to start looking somewhere he had never once thought to control. First Baptist's current pastor was younger than I expected, a man in his early 40s who had taken over the congregation only a few years earlier and hadn't known Opal personally, but he was generous with his time and, more usefully, with access to old church directories and prayer group rosters going back decades. I spent an afternoon in a small back office lined with filing cabinets, working through membership records for the women's circle Opal had belonged to for most of her adult life, cross-referencing names against anyone still living in or around Bardstown. One name in particular kept surfacing in the margins of old meeting notes, written in careful pencil beside dates going back well over a decade, mentioned alongside Opal's more often than any other, a woman's careful cursive noting them as prayer partners for over a decade. Not a woman at all, it turned out, but a man. Franklin Ossie, listed in one older directory as a retired attorney and, more recently, as a deacon at the church. I found him 2 counties over, retired for nearly 15 years, living alone in a small farmhouse surrounded by fields he still worked himself, out of habit more than necessity. When I called and explained who I was, there was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought the call might have dropped entirely. "Renee Calloway," he finally said, his voice warm but careful. "Opal talked about you more than almost anyone else in her life. I wondered, honestly, if you'd ever come looking." We met the following morning at his kitchen table, considerably more modest than Harlan's polished office, but somehow far more reassuring in its plainness. Franklin was a tall, deliberate man, the kind who chose his words carefully and meant every one of them fully once he'd chosen it. 13 years ago, he said, your grandmother came to me. Not through the church exactly, though that's where we knew each other from. She'd started to notice her own mind slipping in small ways, and she was frightened, not for herself, but for you. She told me what had happened in your family, how you'd been the only one willing to protect her, and how you'd paid the highest possible price for it. He reached into a worn leather satchel beside his chair and pulled out a slim folder, considerably thinner than anything Harlan had ever produced, but heavier, somehow, in my hands when he passed it across the table. "She didn't trust Harlan," he continued. "Not fully. Not for years before she ever said so out loud to me. She never told me exactly why, only that something about the way he handled the family's business had started to feel wrong to her, long before either of us understood how right she was to feel that way. So she asked me to help her set something up entirely outside his reach. An irrevocable trust, established with a portion of her own personal savings, money that had never belonged to the Calloway business, money she'd kept separate her entire married life without your grandfather or your father ever fully realizing how much of it there was. My hands were shaking slightly as I opened the folder. Inside was a trust document, dated 13 years earlier, naming me as the sole beneficiary, managed by an independent trustee at a bank in Elizabethtown, entirely untouched by anyone in my family, entirely unknown to anyone who had spent the last several weeks combing through every other piece of paper connected to our name. "She made me promise," Franklin said quietly, that I would only ever tell you if you came looking on your own, with your own questions, in your own time. She didn't want it handed to you like a rescue. She wanted you to know, when the moment came, that you'd found the truth yourself, the same way you always had. I sat with the folder open in front of me for a long moment, unable to speak. Tears blurring the careful legal language on the page until I had to blink hard to keep reading it. 13 years. 13 years this document had existed, quietly, patiently, waiting for me to find my own way back to it. While I had spent that same stretch of time believing my grandmother's final years had left me with nothing but a vague, half-remembered promise and a folder full of Harlan's careful evasions. Why didn't she just tell me outright? I asked. That day at the facility, why make it a puzzle instead of simply telling me what she'd done? Franklin considered the question seriously before answering, the way I imagined he'd once considered every question a client brought to his office. I think, he said slowly, she was afraid that if word ever got back to your father, or to Harlan, before the trust was fully settled and irrevocable, someone might have found a way to contest it, or pressure her into undoing it while her mind was still slipping in and out of clarity. An irrevocable trust protects itself precisely because nobody, not even the person who created it, can simply reach back in and change their mind. She needed time for it to become unshakable before anyone else knew to look for it. Does anyone else know Harlan? My father? Harlan doesn't know, Franklin said, and something in his voice hardened slightly for the first time since we'd sat down together. Opal was very specific about that. She used a different bank entirely, a trustee with no connection whatsoever to Pruitt and Kessler. Precisely so, his firm would have no visibility into it at all. I've often wondered, over the years, exactly what she suspected about that man that she never fully explained to me. I thought about the acknowledgement of distribution sitting in my car, the document with my name erased entirely from my grandmother's final wishes, prepared under Harlan's own letterhead during a period when her medical records showed her struggling to recognize her own son. Whatever Opal had suspected, quietly, without ever fully naming it even to the one person she trusted enough to help her outmaneuver it. I was beginning to understand with a cold, mounting certainty exactly how right she had been. I closed the folder gently, setting it down carefully on the wooden table between us as though it might tear if I handled it too roughly, and I closed my eyes briefly, then asked Franklin the one question that had been sitting quietly underneath everything else since the moment I'd opened it. If Harlan Pruitt hadn't handled the one arrangement that genuinely protected me, what had he been doing with everything else, and why had he gone to such apparent lengths to erase my name from Opal's final estate documents entirely? Franklin was quiet for a while, rising slowly from his chair to refill both our coffee cups before he answered. The deliberate pause of a man choosing to speak carefully about a colleague he'd known for decades, even one he no longer fully trusted. I don't think Harlan set out to do anything dramatic, he said finally, choosing each word with the same care I imagined he'd once brought to closing arguments decades earlier. I don't think there was some grand scheme sitting behind all of this from the beginning. I think it was smaller than that, and in some ways more ordinary, which almost makes it worse to sit with once you understand it fully. He explained what he understood, pieced together patiently over years of small-town professional overlap, quiet church gossip that traveled further than anyone intended, and the occasional guarded conversation at a bar association dinner neither of them particularly enjoyed attending but both continued showing up to out of long habit. Harlan's firm had managed the Calloway family's legal affairs for 3 generations, a relationship worth a steady, comfortable retainer every single year. along with referral business from half the families in town who trusted the Calloway name enough to trust whoever the Calloways trusted. When Opal's estate began to look complicated, when a granddaughter's estrangement threatened to introduce an outside variable into what had always been simple, single-air management running straight through Walter and, eventually, Grant, Harlan had apparently made a quiet, practical decision. Cleaner paperwork, fewer named beneficiaries, one uncomplicated line of succession meant a smoother, more manageable relationship with the family, whose business had paid his firm's bills for decades. "It wasn't about hating you," Franklin said, meeting my eyes steadily across the table. "I don't believe Harlan Pruitt has ever spent much time thinking about you at all, if I'm honest, and I say that without any particular kindness toward him. It was about convenience, about keeping a valuable, decades-long client relationship simple and profitable, the kind of retainer a man plans his own retirement around. You were an inconvenient loose end in an otherwise tidy arrangement, and men like Harlan have a long, quiet history of tidying up loose ends without ever fully reckoning with what that tidying actually costs the people standing on the other end of it." I sat with that explanation for a long moment, turning it over slowly the way I'd turned over so many other pieces of this story in recent weeks, and I found, to my own surprise, that it didn't make me feel better exactly, but it did make a strange, unwelcome kind of sense out of something that had otherwise felt entirely senseless to me since the moment I'd first sat down across from Harlan's polished desk. This hadn't been a grand betrayal born of malice. It had been something smaller and, in its own way, more damning. A professional simply optimizing his own comfortable arrangement at the expense of a granddaughter he'd stopped bothering to think of as a person with a legitimate claim of her own. "The acknowledgement of distribution," I said slowly, tapping the edge of the folder, "the one with my name missing entirely. Why go that far? Why not simply leave me out of conversations?" Rather than formally erasing me from a legal document, Franklin's expression sobered further. "That," he said, "I genuinely don't have a full answer for. That step feels different to me than simple convenience. That feels like someone actively working to make certain a mistake could never be corrected later, even if somebody eventually came looking the way you have now." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us turning the question over without quite reaching the bottom of it. Outside his kitchen window, a tractor moved slowly across a neighboring field. The ordinary rhythm of a Kentucky morning continuing on entirely indifferent to the quiet reckoning happening at his table. "I want to ask you something else," I said, finally, after a long pause between us. "Do you think Harlan knows about the trust you and Grandma set up?" Even now, Franklin shook his head slowly. "I've kept that arrangement entirely separate for 13 years, exactly the way Opal asked me to. Different bank, different trustee, no paperwork that would ever cross Harlan's desk by accident. As far as I know, he has no idea it exists." He paused, considering something further. Though I'll admit, if he did somehow suspect it, that might explain a great deal about how hard he's apparently worked to make sure the rest of her estate looked airtight and uncomplicated. A man protecting a lie sometimes works harder at the details than a man telling the truth ever needs to. I thought about the acknowledgement of distribution again. The careful, cold, official language erasing me entirely from my own family's final accounting, as though I had never once existed. And I began to wonder, sitting there in Franklin's modest kitchen with a folder that proved my grandmother had never once stopped fighting for me, whether Harlan's carelessness with the truth ran even deeper than either of us yet fully understood. Before I finally left Franklin's farmhouse that morning, the sun now fully risen over his quiet fields, he told me one more thing, almost as an afterthought, The way important details sometimes arrive only once a conversation has already begun winding down. 3 years ago, he said. Harlan and I had a disagreement over a small piece of your grandmother's affairs, unrelated to the trust itself, just a routine matter of transferring certain records between our offices after her death. He called me frustrated, insisting I hand over documentation I felt, at the time, belonged more properly with my own files. Kentucky's a one-party consent state for phone recordings. I record most of my professional calls as a matter of habit, something I picked up decades ago after a dispute nearly cost a client dearly over somebody's faulty memory of a conversation. I still have that recording, if you'd like to hear it. I told him I would. He found the file on an old external hard drive he kept tucked in a desk drawer beside a stack of yellowed legal pads, connected it carefully to a laptop that looked considerably newer than everything else in the room, and played it for me across his kitchen table while the coffee between us went slowly cold. Harlan's voice, unmistakable even through the tinny laptop speakers, filled the small room, brisk and irritated in a way I had never once heard him sound during any of the warm, easy conversations I remembered from childhood. "I don't need you complicating a file that's already been finalized, Franklin," Harlan's recorded voice said. "I adjusted a few lines to keep everything consistent with how the family wanted it handled. That's all this is. There's no reason to make it more complicated than it needs to be." "Adjusted how?" Harlan Franklin's recorded voice asked, calm, careful, clearly already suspicious even then. There was a pause on the recording, then Harlan's voice again, quieter this time, almost dismissive. "A few lines here and there, nothing that changes the substance of anything. It just makes things simpler for the Callaways going forward. You know how these families are once there's been a falling out. Cleaner paperwork means fewer headaches for everyone." The recording ended there, Franklin explaining that the call had moved on to other matters shortly afterward. Nothing else relevant caught on tape. But what was there, sitting quietly on an old hard drive in a farmhouse 2 counties away from anyone who might have thought to look for it, was exactly the piece I needed. A signed, forged document showing my exclusion from Opal's estate. A recorded admission, in Harlan's own voice, that he had personally adjusted lines in family paperwork to keep things simpler, without ever specifying to whom, or with what authority, or with whose actual knowledge and consent. It wasn't a full confession. Harlan had been careful, even in a private, unguarded conversation, never to say anything as plainly damning as I had almost dared to hope for, but paired with the forged signature dates, the medical records showing Opal's documented confusion, and the independent trust that proved beyond any doubt what she had actually wanted for me. It was enough. I understood. Sitting in Franklin's kitchen with that recording still echoing faintly in my ears, more than enough. Franklin made me a copy of the audio file onto a small flash drive, along with copies of every document he'd already shown me, sliding the small collection across the table with the same careful, deliberate movement he seemed to bring to everything. "I should have come to you sooner," he said. "I told myself I was honoring Opal's wishes by waiting for you to find your own way here, and maybe that's even true. But I've also wondered, more than once over the years, whether I let caution become an excuse for staying comfortable and uninvolved." "You kept your promise to her," I told him, and I meant it. "That's not nothing, Franklin. That's actually the rarest thing in this whole story." He walked me out to my car, the morning sun fully up now over his fields, and before I left, he rested a hand briefly on my shoulder. "Your grandmother used to say you were the only one in that family who ever asked questions because you wanted the truth, not because you wanted a particular answer," he said. "I believed her then. I believe her a great deal more now, having watched you work through all of this so carefully." I drove back toward Nashville with the flash drive sitting on the passenger seat, The same seat where Harlan's vague reassurances had once sat uselessly only weeks earlier, and I felt something settle into place in my chest that I hadn't felt in a very long time. Not triumph exactly, but something steadier, something closer to vindication earned the slow, careful way rather than handed to me by chance. I called Diane Foss from the road, laying out everything I now had in careful, methodical order, the way I'd been trained to present evidence to anyone who needed to evaluate it clearly. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. "This is significant," she said finally. "This isn't a family disagreement anymore. Renee, this is professional misconduct, potentially outright fraud, and you have documentation strong enough to take to the state bar, and possibly to a civil court, if that's the direction you decide to go." I told her I needed a few days to think about exactly what I wanted to do with it. What I didn't tell her, not yet, was that I already knew the first thing I needed to do before any of the rest of it. I needed to sit my entire family down together, all of them, and finally lay the whole truth out on the table where none of us could look away from it any longer. I asked my parents to invite Harlan to the house, framing it as a meeting about finalizing the paperwork Diane needed for the store's restructuring, a reasonable enough request given everything else happening in the family's finances that week. I didn't tell them why I truly wanted him there. I wanted their reactions to be honest, unrehearsed, because I suspected, correctly as it turned out, that genuine shock would matter more than anything I could say myself. We gathered in the same living room where Walter and Judith had once told me I was no longer their daughter, an irony I had chosen deliberately, though I never said so out loud to anyone. Walter and Judith sat together on the couch. Grant sat in the armchair, closer to the center of the room now than he had ever positioned himself before, and when Harlan arrived, smiling, unhurried, carrying his familiar leather folder, he took the remaining chair without any sense that he was walking into anything other than a routine family meeting. I let him settle in before I began. I laid out the documents one at a time, the way I had with Grant weeks earlier, though this time my hands were steady in a way they hadn't been then, steadied by weeks of careful, methodical preparation. "Harlan," I said, "I want to talk about my grandmother's estate." His easy smile flickered, just slightly, the same small tell I'd noticed in his office weeks before. "Of course," he said. "Though I believe we discussed very little," I said. "Because you told me almost nothing true." I placed the addendum in front of him, the one redirecting the Fielding House pledge, dated days after a documented cognitive assessment. Then the acknowledgement of distribution, my name absent from a legal document meant to reflect my grandmother's actual wishes. Then, finally, a printed transcript of the recording Franklin had kept for 3 years. His exact words laid out in black and white on the table between us. The room went very still. The kind of stillness that settles over a house right before a storm finally breaks after hours of gathering pressure. Walter leaned forward, reading the transcript slowly, his face changing as he absorbed each line. Judith's hand rose to her mouth, the same gesture I remembered from the night the bank had called about foreclosure, except this time the fear on her face was pointed somewhere entirely different. "This is a distortion," Harlan said, his voice tight now, all the earlier warmth gone from it entirely. "Documents from this many years back, taken out of context. A private conversation twisted to sound far worse than... Grandma told me, years before she died, that a friend from church helped her protect something for me," I said, cutting through his explanation before it could gather momentum. "Not you, Harlan, never you. For this, I found that friend. I found the trust he helped her set up specifically because she didn't trust you with it. I found medical records showing exactly when her mind was slipping, matched precisely against the dates on documents bearing your letterhead. And now I have your own voice, on tape, admitting you adjusted family paperwork without ever specifying to whom you answered, or why. Harlan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Some familiar, practiced defense, clearly failing to fully form this time. Walter set the transcript down slowly, his hands trembling now for an entirely different reason than the foreclosure notice had caused weeks earlier. He looked at Harlan for a long moment, a man he had trusted for 40 years. And something in his face hardened into a version of him I hadn't seen since long before I was disowned. The version capable of running a business with real conviction rather than simply inherited habit. "Harlan," my father said, his voice low and absolutely steady. "I think you need to explain yourself. And I think, for the first time in this entire ordeal, I am finally ready to believe my daughter over you." Harlan looked around the room, searching, I think, for some ally who might soften the moment, and found none. Judith's face had gone pale and rigid. Grant sat forward in his chair, arms braced on his knees, watching with an intensity that surprised me. My brother, of all people, finally on the correct side of a family reckoning for once. "I want to be very clear about something," I said, before Harlan could gather himself into another practiced deflection. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm not interested in humiliating you in front of a family you've served for decades. I am here because my grandmother spent the last years of her life quietly outmaneuvering you to protect me. And she deserves to have that effort finally honored instead of buried." "Everything I did," Harlan said, his voice smaller now, stripped of its usual polish, "I did to keep this family's affairs simple, to protect all of you from unnecessary complication." "You didn't protect us," Walter said, cutting him off with a sharpness I hadn't heard from my father in 15 years, not even the night he'd told me I was no longer his daughter. "You protected your own retainer. You let my mother's actual wishes get buried under paperwork that was convenient for you, and you let my daughter get erased from her own grandmother's estate without a single word of warning to any of us." Judith spoke next, her voice trembling but clear. 40 years. Harlan, 40 years we trusted you with everything that mattered to this family, and you used that trust to make your own job easier at our expense. At Renee's expense most of all. I watched Harlan's composure finally, fully crack, the practiced warmth gone completely now, replaced by something smaller and more exposed. A man who had built an entire career on being trusted without question, suddenly and irreversibly out of excuses. Harlan left the house that evening without another word of real explanation, his composure gone entirely. The leather folder he'd carried in with such practiced confidence left forgotten on the coffee table until Grant finally picked it up and set it aside. Nobody moved for a long while after the door closed behind him. The four of us sitting together in a silence that felt, for once, like something shared rather than something imposed. It was Judith, finally, who broke the silence, asking quietly what happened next. Diane Foss walked us through it over the following weeks, patiently, sitting at my parents' kitchen table more than once with a legal pad and a steady, reassuring voice. The same careful, unhurried explanations she'd once given me 15 years earlier when I was the frightened one asking what came after reporting a suspicion out loud to a stranger on a phone line. We filed a formal complaint with the Kentucky Bar Association, submitting the forged documents, the medical records, and Franklin's recording as supporting evidence. Separately, Diane began preparing a civil claim to recover what remained recoverable of Opal's actual intended estate. a process she warned us could take months, possibly longer, given how carefully Harlan appeared to have covered his tracks over the years. I want to be honest with you about something, because it matters to how the rest of this settled. I did not want revenge in the way people often imagine wanting it, some dramatic public unraveling, some satisfaction in watching Harlan Pruitt lose everything all at once. What I wanted, and what I ultimately got instead, was slower and quieter, and I came to understand over the following months, far more meaningful than any dramatic public reckoning could ever have been. The Bar Association's investigation moved forward methodically. Harlan's license was eventually suspended pending a full hearing, and several other former clients. Once word began quietly circulating through the county, came forward with their own long-buried questions about paperwork that had never quite added up. He did not go to prison, he did not lose his home, but he lost the one thing that had mattered most to him for 4 decades, the trusted, unquestioned relationship with an entire community that had once opened every door in town for him without hesitation, greeted him warmly at church, invited him to every wedding and funeral that mattered, and never once thought to question a signature bearing his letterhead. The trust Opal had established for me, once formally acknowledged by the courts and finally released from 13 years of quiet, patient waiting, gave me resources I hadn't expected and, honestly, wasn't entirely sure how to feel about receiving so many years after her death. I want to be clear that I did not use that money to bail out my family's business, and I did not use it to punish anyone either. I used a portion of it, carefully and deliberately, to help my parents transition into a smaller, more manageable home, once the store's remaining assets were finally sold off to settle what could be settled of Grant's debts. A process that took nearly 4 months and closed quietly, without any of the ceremony that had once accompanied every major decision the store ever made under my father's ownership. I set the rest aside, quietly, for reasons that would only become clear to me later, once I understood more fully what I actually wanted this money to represent going forward. Grant sold his truck within the month, using the proceeds toward the smallest of his private loans, and took a job managing inventory at a hardware supplier 2 towns over, a considerable step down from running his own store, though he never once complained about it in my presence. Watching him adjust to that smaller, humbler version of his life was, in its own strange way, one of the more hopeful developments of that entire difficult year. He called me most Sundays after that, always around the same time in the early evening, awkward at first, both of us relearning how to talk to each other without 15 years of silence and a fresh betrayal sitting between every sentence. Slowly, those calls became less awkward. He asked about Casey. He asked, tentatively at first, whether he could visit sometime, and I told him yes, when he was ready, on the same careful terms I'd once offered our parents. No sudden gestures, no expensive apologies standing in for honest ones. Just time, earned slowly, the only currency I had ever really trusted in this family since everything fell apart. Walter and Judith's transition into their smaller home took most of the following spring. I helped them sort through decades of belongings, an exhausting, often emotional process that surfaced old photographs, forgotten letters, and, more than once, quiet tears from both of them over things I hadn't expected to move me nearly as much as they did. My mother kept a small box of Opal's old recipe cards, the corners softened from years of use, and she cried harder over that box than she had over almost anything else during the entire move. "She would be so proud of you," Judith told me one afternoon, holding one of those cards in her hands, her voice thick. I think some part of me has always known that. I just didn't want to admit what it meant about the rest of us. I didn't have a response ready for that. I simply sat beside her at the small kitchen table in their new, smaller home, and let the silence between us hold something gentler than it ever had before. Looking back now on that entire difficult year, I want to be clear that none of this healed quickly, or completely, or in the tidy, linear way people sometimes hope stories like mine will resolve. Trust, once broken as thoroughly as ours had been, doesn't rebuild itself on the strength of a single dramatic confrontation. However satisfying that confrontation might feel in the moment, it rebuilds slowly, through hundreds of small, ordinary choices made consistently over time. And I was determined, walking into that next difficult year, not to mistake one honest evening for the whole of the work still required. With Grant, I set specific terms, spoken plainly rather than left to assumption. He could call, he could visit, with notice, never unannounced. He could not ask me for money, not once, not even indirectly, not even during his hardest months adjusting to his new, smaller job, if he wanted my forgiveness. And I told him this directly one Sunday afternoon on the phone. He would need to earn it the slow way, through years of consistency rather than a single, overwhelming gesture, the same way any stranger would have to earn trust from someone who had been badly hurt before. He accepted those terms without argument, and more importantly, he kept to them, month after month, in a way that gradually, cautiously, began to mean something. With my parents, the terms were different, shaped less by anger now, and more by a simple insistence on honesty going forward. I told them clearly that I would not pretend the last 15 years hadn't happened, that I would not simply fold back into the family as though no time had passed at all. I wanted real conversations, not comfortable silences papered over with politeness. I wanted them to actually ask about my life, about Adam, about Casey, about the career they had never once shown curiosity toward before everything fell apart, instead of only discussing whatever crisis had brought us back into contact in the first place. Judith struggled with this more than Walter did, in some ways. Old habits of image management ran deep in her, decades of prioritizing how our family appeared over how we actually treated each other. But she tried, visibly and consistently, in a way that surprised me more than once. She started asking real questions. She sat with uncomfortable silences instead of rushing to fill them with something more palatable. One afternoon, months into this slow rebuilding, she told me she had started attending a different women's group at church, one focused less on appearances and more, in her words, on actually being honest with each other for once. And I understood, hearing that, exactly how much her own reckoning had cost her, quietly, apart from anything I had directly witnessed. It was Judith who finally said the words I had waited 15 years to hear, sitting across from me at my own kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening, months after Harlan's confrontation, long after the initial shock of everything had worn into something steadier and more honest between us. "We were wrong," she said. "Not just about the money, about you, about the kind of daughter you actually were the whole time, while we told ourselves a different story because it was easier to live with." I didn't respond right away. I sat with those words for a long moment, letting them settle fully before I let myself believe them completely. Then I reached across the table and took her hand, the first time I had done so in 15 years, and told her, simply, that I believed her. Walter's reckoning looked different from Judith's, quieter in some ways, more practical in others. He never became a man given to long, emotional speeches, and I didn't expect him to start now, at 76, after a lifetime of measuring his own worth in the steady, unglamorous language of running a business well. Instead, he showed his change the way he'd always shown everything that mattered to him, through action rather than words. He called Diane Foss directly, without me prompting him, to ask what he personally could do to help formalize the restitution to Fielding House, the pledge Opal had always intended, redirected once, corrected now, finally, after all these years. He drove himself to the veterans' home the week the paperwork cleared, alone, and stayed for nearly 2 hours, though he never told me exactly what was said there, only that it was, in his words, long overdue. I asked him once, gently, why he'd chosen to handle that particular piece of the reckoning so privately, without inviting me along. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Some debts," he said. "A man needs to settle himself, in his own voice, without his daughter standing there watching him finally do what he should have done 15 years ago. It was, I realized later, the closest thing to a full apology my father ever managed to put into words, delivered sideways, through an explanation about something else entirely. In exactly the way I should have expected from him, after 49 years of knowing him. Casey, watching all of this unfold from the edges over that long, complicated year, asked me once whether I thought I'd ever fully trust my parents again, the way I imagined she trusted Adam and me. I told her the truth, the only honest answer I had. I didn't know yet. Trust, I told her, wasn't something you decided all at once and then simply had forever after. It was something you kept choosing, carefully, one honest exchange at a time, for as long as the other person kept showing you they deserved it. 8 months after that Saturday evening when I found my parents standing on my porch, I hosted a dinner at my house, nothing elaborate, nothing that would have made the evening news or impressed anyone watching from the outside. Just an ordinary Sunday meal, the kind that used to happen every week in houses across this whole country before life got complicated enough to make ordinary things feel rare. Adam grilled chicken in the backyard while Casey, home for the weekend, set the table with the mismatched dishes we'd collected over 15 years of building a life together. Grant arrived first, on time. With a store-bought pie, he'd clearly agonized over selecting, apologizing for it being store-bought before anyone had even asked. Walter and Judith arrived 20 minutes later, Judith carrying a small potted plant for my kitchen windowsill. Walter carrying, almost sheepishly, an old photo album he'd found while sorting through the last of their belongings from the house I grew up in. We sat around my table that evening, crowded a little uncomfortably since I'd never bought chairs for a family this size, all 5 of us plus Adam, and talked about ordinary things. Casey's upcoming clinical rotation, Grant's new co-worker who kept trying to convince him to take up fishing, a recipe of opals that Judith had finally worked up the courage to attempt from memory. Close, but not quite right. Missing some small ingredient none of us could name for certain anymore. Walter opened the photo album partway through dinner, and we passed it around the table, laughing at old pictures of Grant and me as children. At Opal, standing proudly in front of the store the year it turned 50 years old. At a young, unguarded version of my parents I barely recognized from the 2 careful, wounded people who had shown up on my porch 8 months earlier. I want to tell you this story ends with some grand, cinematic reconciliation, tears and embraces, and every wound instantly healed. It didn't. And I've come to believe that's a more honest ending than the version people usually expect. What actually happened was smaller and, I think, more durable than that. We built something new, carefully, out of the wreckage of what had broken, not a return to what we'd once been, because that version of our family had never been as solid as it looked from the outside anyway. But something different, something that could actually hold weight because it was built on honesty instead of performance. Pruitt's disbarment hearing concluded that spring. He surrendered his license rather than fight the full proceeding, a quiet ending to a career that had once seemed, to an entire town, unassailable. The civil case Diane pursued on Opal's behalf recovered a portion of what had been diverted over the years. Funds that went, finally, exactly where my grandmother had always intended them to go, to Fielding House, to men who had come home from wherever they'd been and hadn't quite made it all the way back yet. I stood at the dedication ceremony for the newly funded wing that autumn, alongside my entire family, and I thought about a Sunday afternoon years earlier, coffee gone lukewarm on Opal's kitchen table. Her voice calm and certain, describing a promise she said she hadn't gotten around to putting on paper yet. She had, of course. She had gotten around to it in exactly the way that mattered most. Quietly. Patiently. Trusting that the truth would eventually find its way to the people who needed it, even if it took 13 years and a financial crisis and a forged signature to finally get there. People sometimes ask me when I tell pieces of this story whether I regret the choice I made at 34, picking up that phone and reporting what I'd seen, knowing even then it might cost me everything. I don't. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. There is a version of this story where I stayed quiet, where I told myself it wasn't my business, where I kept my family intact by simply looking away from something I knew, in my heart, was wrong. I would have kept my parents. I would have kept 15 years. I lost instead. But I would have lost something else entirely. Something I'm not sure I could have lived with losing. The version of myself who was willing to tell the truth even when the truth cost her everything she thought she couldn't survive without. Family, I've come to understand, isn't a birthright that entitles anyone to unconditional loyalty regardless of how they treat the people who love them. It's something closer to a practice, a daily, deliberate choice to protect and be honest with the people who have earned that protection through how they actually behave, not simply through the accident of shared blood. My grandmother understood that better than anyone else in our family, and she spent her final years quietly making sure I would understand it too. Long after she was gone. Later that evening, after Grant and my parents had gone home and Casey had headed back upstairs to finish packing for her drive back to school, Adam and I sat together on the back porch, the same porch where 3 people I once thought I'd lost forever had stood 8 months earlier, holding a hat, wrapped in a coat buttoned wrong, waiting to see whether I would let them back in. He didn't say much, the way he rarely did when a moment felt too large for words, and I found I didn't need him to. He simply reached over and took my hand, the same way he had at that coffee shop years earlier, the same steady, unhurried presence that had taught me, patiently, over more than a decade, what it actually meant to be loved without conditions attached. I thought about Opal often in the months that followed, more than I had allowed myself to in years. I visited her grave that autumn, not alone this time, but with Judith beside me, both of us kneeling in the grass to leave fresh flowers, my mother crying quietly in a way I understood. Finally, wasn't performance at all. Just an old woman grieving honestly for the first time in 15 years. I told Opal, out loud, standing there in that quiet cemetery, that her plan had worked, that the truth had found its way home exactly the way she'd trusted it eventually would, even if it had taken far longer than either of us could have imagined that Sunday afternoon over lukewarm coffee. If you've ever had to walk away from people who called your love inconvenient, who mistook your honesty for betrayal, I hope this story tells you something worth carrying forward. What gets rejected doesn't lose its value simply because the people who should have cherished it failed to recognize what they had. Sometimes it just takes longer than anyone expects for the truth to finally find its way home. And sometimes, when it finally does, it brings the whole family back together to stand in the light of it. Together, at last, older and humbler and considerably more honest than they ever managed to be before everything fell apart. And if this story stayed with you the way it has stayed with me, I hope you'll carry a piece of it forward into whatever quiet reckoning your own family might still be waiting on somebody brave enough to finally begin.